If you've ever wondered why the 1800s were so spectacularly packed with bizarre superstitions, the kind of beliefs that make you lean back, blink slowly and ask, did people really think that? The answer is simple. The century was one long anxiety attack wearing a top hat. This was the era when humanity sprinted headfirst into modernity while simultaneously dragging along several centuries' worth of fears, mystical assumptions, and deeply questionable logic. Think of it as society upgrading to a steam-powered engine while still relying on emotional software last updated during the Middle Ages. The good news, people were alive. The bad news, their coping strategies were creative. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The 1800s were a time of such rapid technological expansion that ordinary citizens basically lived inside a century-long identity crisis. One morning, you'd wake up hearing villagers whisper about crop-ruining spirits, and by lunchtime a locomotive would come screaming through your town like the world's angriest metal dragon. Imagine living in a world where half your neighbours believed ghosts lived in the laundry, and the other half believed electricity might steal your soul. Naturally, superstitions flourished. They were the emotional bubble wrap cushioning society from the terrifying fact that no one really understood anything. Industrialization didn't help. Before factories took over, people feared predictable things. Wolves, famine, suspiciously cloudy milk. But by the mid-1800s, society had new and exciting threats. Trains could explode, lamps could detonate. Food adulteration was so common that your daily bread might contain actual ground bones. And medical advice? Let's just say that the century's most popular cure for nerves involved a doctor handing you a glass of wine and telling you to stop thinking so hard. Knowledge was spreading, but so was chaos. And where chaos thrives, superstition happily builds a summer home. Religion also contributed to this pot of delightful nonsense. The 1800s weren't just a devout age, they were a devout age with a flair for melodrama. Many communities believed that spiritual forces intervened constantly in daily life, not gently or subtly, but with the enthusiasm of an overzealous stage actor. If your bread didn't rise properly, it might not be your yeast, it might be the devil, who apparently had nothing better to do than sabotage carbohydrates. If your clothes tore mysteriously, some communities believed it was a sign of moral decay. Yes, in the 1800s, even your wardrobe could judge you, but the strangest ingredient was the century's relationship with science. The world was stuffed with newly discovered phenomena, microbes, magnetism, chemical reactions, but very few people actually knew how any of it worked. As a result, scientific breakthroughs didn't replace superstitions, they simply inspired new ones. The idea that invisible organisms could make you sick was too abstract for many, so people improvised their own interpretations. If things I can't see are trying to kill me, they reasoned, then everything I can't see is also trying to kill me. This is how you end up with respectable adults believing that sleeping with the window open might invite in spirits that specialize in causing sore throats. Even medical professionals weren't helping. A doctor in the 1800s might reassure you one moment that your headache was caused by overactive blood, and the next moment warn you not to put cold butter on bread because it could freeze your organs. Surgeons operated with no anesthesia, unless you count screaming, and hygiene was considered optional. If you somehow survived a doctor's visit, of course you would cling to superstitions like sacred life rafts. Geographically, the century was a stew of old and new cultures colliding. Rural folklore clashed with urban myths, immigrant traditions blended with local legends, and rapidly shifting social hierarchies created fresh anxieties. When everyone is worried about status, reputation, finances, and whether their new coal stove might spontaneously combust, superstitions become the psychological glue holding society together. A simple rule like never stir soup counterclockwise suddenly felt like a much-needed instruction manual for existence. But perhaps the real reason superstitions thrived is emotional. The 1800s were a time when everything bad that happened was assumed to be your personal fault. House burned down? You must have angered something. Child caught a fever? Someone in your family probably slept wrong, lost your shoe in the mud, or a spirit of the road is displeased. People lived inside a constant cloud of guilt, which may explain why they invented so many peculiar behaviours designed to prevent misfortune. It's hard to feel powerless when you believe evil can be defeated simply by placing bread under your pillow or tying your shoelaces in a specific order. What made the century magical and utterly absurd was this unique blend of fear, hope, ignorance, innovation, and relentless optimism. The 1800s were an age when people truly believed the universe was paying close attention to their daily habits. Whether you were eating breakfast, putting on clothes, or choosing where to sleep, someone somewhere had a superstition about the right and wrong way to do it. Logic wasn't just optional, it was often considered the least reliable tool in the emotional toolbox. So welcome to the 1800s, where food had feelings, clothing had moral opinions, and sleep was a nightly negotiation with invisible forces. Superstitions weren't just quirky traditions, they were survival strategies for a world hurtling into the unknown. And as we go deeper into this story, remember, the good news is you're alive. The bad news, in the 1800s, that meant everything around you was out to get you, unless you followed the rules. In the 1800s, bread wasn't just food. It wasn't even just a household staple. It was a moral barometer, a spiritual litmus test, and occasionally the 19th century equivalent of a passive-aggressive comment from a relative who means well. Modern humans burn a loaf and think, oops. A Victorian woman burned a loaf and thought, the universe has formally declared me unworthy. Bread had power, not symbolic, poetic power, but genuine, terrifying social power. Your loaf could accuse you of sin, announce your downfall, or signal divine approval, all before it even cooled. To understand why bread became a moral judge, you need to imagine a world where ovens were temperamental beasts. Yeast was a mysterious living creature no one truly understood, and the average kitchen felt more like a chemistry lab run by a very nervous scientist. People didn't know why dough rose, they simply observed that it did, and therefore assumed it must be connected to the forces that governed life, death, luck, and neighbourly gossip. Bread was alive, unpredictable, and occasionally vengeful, which put it in the same emotional category as most household pets of the era. If your loaf rose perfectly, people said it meant your home was pure, your conscience clean, your marriage stable, and your soul in God's good graces. A good loaf could not lie. It was a culinary halo sitting on your kitchen table. Visitors would admire it, not because they wanted to eat it, but because it reassured them that you weren't spiritually contagious. A well-risen loaf told everyone, yes, this household is morally intact. No one here has secretly made a pact with the devil, committed scandalous acts, or harboured improper thoughts about the blacksmith. But if your bread collapsed, oh, you poor thing, your domestic reputation collapsed right along with it. A sinking loaf meant someone in the house had sinned, and it didn't even have the decency to specify who. Imagine trying to enjoy a quiet evening only for your own bread to point at you like a yeasty courtroom witness. Neighbours would whisper. Clergy would raise eyebrows. Children might be told to hold their breath while passing your door in case the misfortune leaked outside. A fallen loaf meant the household had invited darkness, which is a poetic way of saying that the bread accused you before anyone else could. Women especially bore the burden of loaf-based guilt. A flat loaf implied moral disorder, domestic failure, and possibly the onset of supernatural sabotage. Wives would frantically remake dough, convinced they were either cursed, watched by demons, or, the truly horrifying possibility, being judged by their mother-in-law. Some even performed small rituals while kneading, turning the dough clockwise to attract blessings, tapping the loaf 3 times to ward off envy, or whispering prayers as though the yeast were listening and simply needed encouragement. One superstition claimed that if your bread didn't rise, someone had spoken ill of you, which must have made Victorian kitchens sound like buzzing beehives of paranoia. Bakers had their own excuses, naturally. If a customer's bread misbehaved, bakers blamed everything except their own technique. Bad air, they said, as though oxygen itself occasionally developed a rude personality. Wicked spirits, they insisted, suggesting demons had nothing better to do than sabotage carbohydrates. Some even blamed ghosts, which is a delightful image. A spectral figure drifting through the bakery at night, poking dough out of spite. Of course, the superstition only strengthened because bread was so central to survival. A house without bread was a house without structure, nourishment, or normalcy. So if the bread turned out wrong, people assumed the fault lay in the spiritual architecture of the home. Bread was life, therefore bad bread meant bad life. Simple, right? In the 1800s, the logic made perfect sense, or as much sense as anything did in an era when people believed moonlight caused illness and windy days could shatter your soul. Bread also played a role in courtship and marriage. Young women were sometimes judged by their ability to produce a righteous loaf. A suitor might inquire, "Does she bake well?" And people would answer as though discussing her character, not her culinary skill. A woman whose bread consistently fell was advised to pray, change her behaviour, or examine her friendships more carefully, because obviously the dough knew something she didn't. Even funerals weren't safe from bread-based symbolism. In some communities, a collapsed loaf baked on the day someone died was seen as a sign that the spirit had lingered in the home, its presence heavy enough to squash the dough. People would gasp, cross themselves, and absolutely not eat that loaf, because if anything in the 1800s could transmit misfortune, it was spiritually wounded carbohydrates. Meanwhile, a perfectly risen loaf baked during grief was taken as reassurance that the departed had made it safely to the afterlife. Essentially, bread served as a celestial messenger, communicating across worlds like a card-based telegram. But perhaps the most revealing part of this superstition was the emotional weight it carried. Bread didn't just feed you. It judged you, affirmed you, humiliated you, warned you, and occasionally threatened you. It was the 1800s version of an online comment section, unpredictable, unfiltered, and constantly reflecting your deepest fears back at you. And yet people kept baking day after day, convinced that the next loaf might finally confirm that everything in their life was okay. Imagine living in a world where your mental health depends on yeast performing correctly. The good news, if your bread rose, everyone celebrated. The bad news, if it didn't, even the dough questioned your life choices. If you lived in the 1800s, you didn't simply crack an egg. Oh no, you performed a delicate ritual, as if the egg were a live explosive and you had received exactly 5 minutes of training. Eggs in the Victorian imagination weren't breakfast ingredients. They were mysterious oval-shaped omens waiting to ruin your week. Modern people see an egg and think protein. Victorians saw one and wondered which demon had signed it. The nervousness started the moment an egg entered the house. You didn't casually toss it into a basket. You held it carefully, watching it the way one watches a suspiciously quiet toddler, because one wrong move could apparently open the door to the supernatural. A cracked eggshell wasn't just damage, it was a portal. This was the era of the witch's hole, the belief that witches could slip into your household through a broken shell, the way raccoons slip through open windows. If even a sliver of shell broke incorrectly, someone would gasp, someone would cross themselves, and someone else would blame the nearest unmarried woman. Because of this fear, eggshell disposal became a strangely intense activity. You couldn't throw shells in the bin, that was basically an invitation. People burned them, crushed them into invisible dust, buried them under the threshold, or threw them into the fire while shouting something that sounded vaguely threatening. Some households even made the children stomp the shells to teach the witch a lesson, a wonderful example of Victorian parenting. fight the dark forces, kids, and then do your chores. And heaven forbid you left a half shell out in the open. Folklore insisted that witches used abandoned eggshells as boats. Not metaphorically, literally. The idea was that witches could shrink themselves, hop into an eggshell, and sail off to secret meetings. Picture a tiny sorceress paddling across a puddle in your backyard, muttering curses under her breath. This image was somehow terrifying rather than hilarious, and people took great care to smash shells to prevent these micro-voyages. The good news, you were saving your soul. The bad news, you looked absolutely ridiculous doing it. Handling the egg itself was equally perilous. If the wrong person touched an egg, usually someone with a known history of bad luck, strange dreams, or simply a face the neighbours found too angular, the egg could turn. That meant anything from spoiling early to predicting illness to summoning another round of family drama. So households created elaborate systems of who was and wasn't allowed to touch the eggs. Some families designated a single egg handler, usually the calmest or least cursed person available. Imagine being told at age 10 that you had the best aura for eggs. In the 1800s, that was practically a resume. Then came the superstition about staring chickens. Modern chickens have a look that's intense, but Victorians took it personally. If a chicken stared too long, and chickens stare a lot, it meant the bird was plotting something. Chickens were suspected of witchcraft, blessing or cursing eggs, or predicting who'd catch a cold next Thursday. A chicken locking eyes with you across the yard was considered an omen that you should change your travel plans, reconsider a marriage, or at least avoid going outside without a hat, because nothing says danger like a bird the size of a loaf of bread giving you side-eye. Eggs also played a key role in diagnosing future misfortunes. People dropped eggs into bowls of water to interpret the patterns, like a poultry-themed horoscope. If the whites formed a ring, marriage was coming. If they formed a blob, illness loomed. If they formed something that looked vaguely like a ghost, you had exactly 3 days to panic before realizing it was probably just egg white. But by then, the entire household had already committed to mourning or celebration, because once you believed the egg, there was no going back. Some believed you could tell a person's fate by how an egg cracked in your hand. A spotless break meant good fortune, an uneven split meant trouble, and a mess on the floor meant you'd obviously angered the spirits. Did the spirits care about your clumsiness? Of course not. But in the 1800s, supernatural blame was the most convenient customer service system. Anything went wrong, you filed a complaint directly with the spirit world. Even cooking with eggs came with anxiety. If your omelette tore, it meant bad weather. If the yolk broke, someone was jealous of you. If the eggs scrambled unevenly, a secret enemy lurked nearby. Imagine waking up in the morning, ruining your breakfast, and immediately assuming that Mrs. Harper from across the lane was plotting your downfall. In Victorian logic, this made perfect sense. Food wasn't just food, it was a message system. There were even rules about storing eggs. Eggs kept pointed end down were safer, while eggs stored incorrectly invited trouble. People drew protective marks on them or whispered prayers over them, turning breakfast preparation into a strange hybrid of grocery management and minor exorcism. In short, the Victorian egg was not a humble ingredient. It was a warning system, a magical device, a cursed object, and, on a bad day, a suspected collaborator with witches. An entire mythology cracked out of something that today you buy in bulk without consulting a priest. The good news, you don't live in a world where breakfast can doom you. The bad news, if Victorians saw how casually you scramble eggs, they'd faint on the spot. If you have ever opened your fridge, smelled the milk and thought, oh no, congratulations, you've shared a tiny sliver of universal human despair with someone from the 1800s. The difference? You probably blame bacteria, heat, or the fact that you forgot to tighten the cap. An 1800s person, however, would immediately blame you. Your emotional choices, your tone of voice, the way you looked at the cow, your personality itself. Because in the 19th century, one thing was absolutely certain. Milk didn't spoil due to science. It spoiled because it had feelings, and it took things personally. Imagine you're a farmer in 1827. You've just milked your cow, you're storing the milk in a cool cellar, and life seems briefly manageable. But the next morning the milk has gone sour. Does this mean the temperature fluctuated? Perhaps bacteria proliferated? No, it means someone in your home had a bad attitude. Milk, according to many 19th century households, was basically a sensitive Victorian poet. It wilted in the presence of negativity. If you were grumpy, milk could sense it. If you and your spouse had an argument, milk would retaliate. If your neighbour glared at your house too intensely, congratulations. Your milk is now curdled and your reputation for emotional stability has evaporated. One of the most enduring beliefs was the power of the evil eye. That infamous cross-cultural fear that someone could sour your luck simply by looking at you the wrong way. In 1800 superstition, cows were apparently the most emotionally fragile creatures alive. If someone cast the evil eye at your cow, it wouldn't get sick or run away or refuse to be milked. No, that would make too much sense. Instead, your cow would produce milk that curdled within hours, clotted into slimy lumps, or worse, refused to churn into butter, leaving you staring at a barrel of sad milk, wondering which neighbour had secretly cursed your dairy supply. In rural villages, people knew exactly who to blame when this happened. The person with the sharp tongue, the one who was too quick with a complaint, the cousin who looked like trouble. Basically, anyone who openly expressed emotions other than mild politeness or weather-based small talk. The logic went like this. If someone was angry around milk or milk-producing creatures, the milk would absorb that rage like a sponge and convert it into chaos. A cranky grandmother walking into the kitchen, the milk shivered in fear. A toddler throwing a tantrum, kiss your butter goodbye. Two adults arguing about whether the cow should be named Daisy or Mildred. Dairy doom. To the 19th century mind, milk was not a neutral product. It was a delicate alchemical substance balanced between purity and corruption. One sour thought away from catastrophe. That's why dairies were treated almost like sacred spaces. Women who handled milk were told to enter the dairy room in a calm, cheerful state of mind. If you felt upset, you had to wait until you had emotionally decompressed. A popular saying in some regions went along the lines of, "A troubled heart makes troubled butter." Others warned that a quarrel in the morning makes sourness by noon. In short, dairy work required the emotional stability of a monk and the serenity of a person who has never interacted with other human beings. There were, of course, rules for guests too. If someone came to your home in a foul mood, it was considered dangerous to let them near your milk supply. Hosts would quickly usher a complaining neighbour out of the kitchen before their negativity could spoil the evening's cream. In some places, particularly in parts of rural Europe, households even created little rituals to block bad moods from entering the dairy. Sometimes this meant drawing a protective symbol on the churn lid. Other times it meant placing iron tools around the milk pans, because apparently milk respected metal more than it respected the humans caring for it. Arguments inside the house were considered especially disastrous. If a married couple raised their voices, older family members would shout warnings like, "Not near the milk," because the milk was assumed to be listening and judging. You could ruin your marriage and your dairy output in one unfortunate afternoon. A double tragedy. Some beliefs went further into full dramatic territory. In certain areas, if milk repeatedly went sour despite everyone pretending to be cheerful, the household accused a witch. Not a metaphorical witch, an actual physical cursing from the shadow of the barn witch. Milk that curdled too quickly, curds that formed strange shapes, or butter that refused to come after hours of churning, signalled one thing: supernatural sabotage. Witch bottles were placed near churns, iron nails were thrown into the fire, and whispered prayers were recited over milk jugs like the dairy was going through a spiritual crisis. Of course, cows weren't off the hook either. A cow that kicked too much, stared too long, or refused to walk where directed could spark fears of bewitchment or ill temper that might poison the milk. Some farmers believed cows could absorb human negativity and then release it into their milk. So if you approached a cow while upset, you weren't simply venting, you were risking breakfast. And let's not forget the scientific confusion of the era. Many people half understood fermentation and temperature, but still wrapped everything in layers of magical thinking. They might know that milk spoiled faster in summer, but they'd still say things like, "The sun is angry today," as if the weather had emotional grievances. Or they'd note that milk stored too close to a smoky fire spoiled more easily. Then conclude, "The milk has taken offence to the smell." In the end, the superstition served as both a cultural rulebook and a warning. Keep your emotions in check or your breakfast will betray you. The 1800s were a time when food reacted to your mood. Household chores required emotional diplomacy, and dairy products were more temperamental than the humans consuming them. The good news? Your milk might stay sweet. The bad news? Only if you pretend to be as cheerful as a singing cartoon milkmaid. In the 1800s, silver wasn't just a metal. It wasn't even just cutlery. It was a lifestyle, a personality trait, a family motto, and occasionally a weapon against invisible forces that Victorians were absolutely convinced were lurking in every room. Today, a silver spoon is shorthand for privilege. In the 19th century, it meant something far more serious. Congratulations, your household has officially decided that demons, poisoners, and moral corruption will not be dining here tonight. Because in the Victorian mind, spoons were not tools, they were shields. Shields against illness, against spiritual infiltration, against bad manners, and, apparently, against toddlers growing into disappointment. To understand why a simple piece of silverware could trigger a household crisis, you must imagine a world where people deeply believed that everything could be explained by vibes. Good vibes made your home prosperous. Bad vibes made your soup curdle and your marriage collapse. So what did they do? They infused objects with moral responsibility. And nothing carried more moral responsibility at the dinner table than the silver spoon. If your household used proper silver, it meant you were purified, respectable, glowing from within with the radiance of a person who polishes cutlery to the brink of mania. If you used cheap metal, or heaven forbid, wood, well, good luck avoiding famine, crime, misfortune, social humiliation, and possibly plague. The strange thing is that the connection between silver and purity wasn't purely superstition, a fact Victorians would have bragged about had they known. Silver does have antibacterial properties. Unfortunately, Victorians managed to take that kernel of truth and stretch it into an Olympic-level long jump. In their minds, if silver killed germs, then surely it also killed evil, repelled curses, and prevented society from unravelling into chaos. Silver spoons were believed to detect poison simply by existing near it, a belief that unfortunately did not stop countless poisonings, because Victorians also believed that if a spoon turns black, someone is trying to murder you, even though the real culprit was almost always sulphur in the food. Imagine hosting a dinner party where everyone stared nervously at their cutlery, occasionally sniffing it like an anxious detective, trying to figure out whether the roast lamb or Aunt Mildred was plotting against them. Silver spoons also became deeply tied to child rearing. Giving a baby a silver spoon wasn't just a gift, it was a declaration, a prophecy, a spell. It was believed that a child who grew up using silver flatware would develop good character, strong virtues, financial stability, and possibly a glowing halo. Not giving your child a silver spoon? Well, you might as well be raising a future pickpocket. Victorians had such intense faith in this superstition that wealthy families gifted silver spoons at births, baptisms, and sometimes even at random Tuesdays, just in case fate needed a reminder. Some households kept entire collections of future success spoons locked in cabinets, polishing them obsessively as if each swipe of the cloth guaranteed a scholarship to Oxford. The panic didn't stop there. Because silver was seen as spiritually protective, people used spoons in genuinely bizarre ways. Some women kept a silver spoon under their pillow to ward off nightmares. Sailors carried spoons as talismans against storms, mutiny, and sea monsters, all of which they believed respected proper dining instruments. Certain towns even believed that stirring tea counterclockwise with a silver spoon would reverse curses, though stirring clockwise too aggressively might accidentally summon bad luck. There were rules for spoons that even modern etiquette books would look at and say, "Okay, that's excessive." And of course there were the social consequences. If a guest arrived at your home and you handed them the wrong type of spoon, say the dessert spoon instead of the soup spoon, this wasn't a minor faux pas. It was a catastrophe. A sign your household was morally unstable, spiritually unprotected, and possibly cursed. Guests judged hosts, hosts judged guests, neighbours judged both, and everyone silently prayed that the spoons weren't whispering their sins to the spirits in the walls. Using improper cutlery placement was basically the Victorian equivalent of announcing to the entire street that your life was in shambles and your family was on the brink of ruin. At high society events, silver spoons became a silent battlefield. People inspected each other's cutlery like jewelers inspecting diamonds. Is this real silver? Is it polished? Does it have the correct monogram? Has it ever been used near cabbage? These were questions with genuine stakes, because in Victorian logic, cleanliness and moral purity were intertwined. A poorly polished spoon meant your soul wasn't polished either. A tarnished spoon, that was practically an omen. Some households even had silver specifically for guests, and silver specifically for the family, because crossing the two might invite spiritual confusion. No one knew what that meant exactly, but they knew it sounded dangerous. The superstition went so deep that during certain epidemics, families clutched their silver spoons like protective charms. Some people even attempted to cure illnesses by placing spoons in cups of water and letting them sit overnight, as if the silver would gently shame the germs out of existence. Others believed that leaving spoons crossed on a table would confuse demons, though demons probably had bigger issues than being outsmarted by cutlery arrangements. In the end, the Great Silver Spoon Panic reveals one important truth about the 1800s. People desperately wanted control. They feared sickness, scandal, poverty, curses, bad luck, and embarrassing dinner parties. Silver spoons became a symbol of reassurance, a shiny, polished promise that maybe, just maybe, the universe wouldn't ruin dessert. And perhaps that's the most charming thing about these superstitions. Despite all the panic, all the rules, and all the polishing, Victorians still managed to spill soup, insult guests, and misunderstand chemistry. The good news, they tried. The bad news, their spoons didn't actually care. If there was one thing the 1800s were absolutely certain of, it was this. Soup had opinions. Not just flavours, not just aromas, actual opinions about your future, your health, your mood, your family's prospects, and whether the sky planned to dump rain on your freshly washed linens. Today we rely on satellites and meteorologists trained in atmospheric science. In the 1800s, people relied on bubbling broth. Why invest in barometers, they figured, when cabbage and barley are already talking? To be fair, soup was one of the very few household items that seemed to do something active. A chair just sat there, a clock ticked. But soup moved. It boiled, steamed, hissed, frothed, and occasionally spit boiling droplets at passers-by. In an era before people fully understood heat conduction, any moving substance was automatically considered magical, or at the very least slightly suspicious. This made soup the perfect candidate for fortune-telling, weather prediction, and the occasional domestic argument about whether that strange bubble meant thunderstorms or just an impatient onion. One of the most widespread beliefs revolved around bubbling patterns. Slow, lazy bubbles meant good weather. Calm skies, gentle breezes, ideal laundry conditions, and a day free from unexpected relatives arriving unannounced. Rapid, aggressive bubbling, however, meant storms. Not mild storms either, dramatic, roof-rattling, goat-stealing storms that sent families racing to bring the chickens indoors. If your pot boiled too violently, people didn't lower the heat. They assumed nature was sending a message. "Pack the window," someone would warn. "The broth is furious today." Then there was the matter of steam. Victorians saw steam as something almost spiritual, a ghost that smelled faintly of potatoes. Thick steam rising straight upward meant good fortune. A gentle curl meant visitors, always described with the same dread people reserve today for finding out their Wi-Fi has stopped working. But steam blown sideways, that was a cosmic announcement that disputes were coming, likely involving money, marriage, property, or whether the cat was possessed. Steam had become the unofficial family therapist, one that never solved anything but made sure the household worried about it. Even the consistency of soup mattered. Thin broth suggested illness or weakness, emotionally, physically, or spiritually. A watery soup was practically an omen of doom. The thicker the soup, the sturdier the future. A robust stew meant abundance, moral health, and the promise that everyone would survive the winter without selling heirlooms or important livestock. In a world without vitamins, the thickness of your soup stood in for actual medical diagnostics. Does your soup stand up on its own? Victorians would ask proudly. Then so shall you. Some households took soup superstition to higher dramatic levels. In parts of rural Europe and North America, families believed soup bubbles could reveal strangers approaching. A single giant bubble meant an unfamiliar man. Several small bubbles meant a group of women. One long-lasting bubble that clung stubbornly to the surface meant a child. Imagine the modern equivalent. Boiling ramen and suddenly yelling, "Prepare the good cushions, a toddler is coming." The bubble forecasting method was so entrenched that some families genuinely panicked when the soup produced no bubbles at all. No bubbles meant unpredictability, and unpredictability was the 1800s equivalent of a horror film. Another cherished superstition dealt with food spirits. Because fermentation, spoilage, and chemical reactions weren't widely understood, many assumed soups had personalities. A stock that boiled over was considered temperamental. A soup that refused to simmer was insulted or moody. Cooks talked to their pots the same way modern people talk to malfunctioning computers. "Come on, work with me. Not today, please." Except in the 1800s, they fully expected the pot to have feelings and maybe even hold grudges. In some households, soup wasn't just a weather indicator. It was also used to detect witchcraft. A pot that spun strangely, simmered unevenly, or bubbled in patterns resembling faces was considered touched by supernatural forces. In Scotland and parts of Eastern Europe, a soup that made a sudden popping noise was taken as a warning of evil eyes or harmful intentions nearby. If the broth sputtered too enthusiastically, someone might dramatically shout, "Someone accursing this house," as if the soup had filed a formal complaint. Even travel was affected. People genuinely believed you could predict whether a journey would be safe based on the morning's soup behaviour. A smooth simmer, safe roads. A pot that boiled over, delayed travel, broken wheels, or meeting a person of troublesome temperament. Soup had become the unlicensed travel agent of the 19th century. Of course, none of this made soup taste better, but in a world where science felt like distant wizardry and weather reports involved opening your window and guessing, people grasped for the meaning wherever they could find it. And if meaning came in the form of violently boiling turnips, so be it. The truth is, these beliefs weren't just about soup. They were about living in a time when nature felt unpredictable and people desperately wanted control, any control. Soup offered the illusion of answers, a sense that the universe was whispering secrets through vegetable steam. And if nothing else, it gave families something to blame. Bad harvest, the broth warned you. Unexpected rain, the soup tried to tell you. Dinner tastes terrible, don't blame the cook, blame the prophecy. In short, in the 1800s, soup wasn't just food. It was a meteorologist, a fortune teller, a behavioural specialist, and occasionally the most dramatic member of the household. If you lived in the 1800s, there were two universal truths. Candles were expensive, and nighttime was when the universe clocked in for its shift of pure nonsense. So naturally, people believed that cutting bread after sunset was basically signing a cosmic permission slip for disaster. Bread in the 19th century wasn't just food, it was emotional support, a moral compass, a weather predictor, a personality test, and apparently a spiritual nightclub. And after dark, all that comforting symbolism transformed into a supernatural liability. Because nothing says cozy family dinner like the fear that slicing a loaf at 8 p.m. might summon a ghost with gluten intolerance. To understand why this superstition existed at all, you have to imagine night in the 1800s, a time when darkness wasn't romantic or mysterious. It was a void filled with wolves, spirits, burglars, demons, and neighbours you owed money to. After sunset, the human imagination became an Olympic athlete sprinting straight into worst-case scenarios. And humble bread, got dragged into this psychological thunderstorm simply because people genuinely believed the boundary between the living world and the spirit world weakened after dark. Daylight meant logic. Nighttime meant, let's blame ghosts for everything and call it a security strategy. In some households, cutting bread after sunset was said to shorten a family member's lifespan. Not yours, specifically, just someone in the family. Nothing says bonding like randomly endangering your cousin's life because you fancied a late-night snack. The logic was hazy, but the fear was crisp. Slicing bread at night represented cutting time, symbolically chopping away days or years from someone's life. This was the kind of metaphorical reasoning that only thrives in eras without binge-watching, indoor plumbing, or a basic understanding of metaphors. Another interpretation was that nighttime bread cutting opened the door, literally or spiritually, to wandering spirits. And of course the spirits in question weren't going to drift through the ceiling or glide through a window. No, they were absolutely going to slip in through the bread. Because apparently ghosts in the 1800s had the same diet as Victorian children. Hungry, unsupervised, and determined to ruin your evening. People believed spirits, demons, and all manner of nocturnal mischief makers were obsessed with fresh bread. Not your soul, not your valuables. Bread. You can imagine a Victorian father yelling, "Quick, close the pantry, the spirits can smell the rye." Some regions believed that if you cut bread after sunset, someone in the house would experience hunger or poverty. The symbolism again was wonderfully dramatic. Slicing the loaf in darkness divided the household's fortune. Bread represented abundance, so cutting it when the hearthlight dimmed supposedly sliced away prosperity itself. If your finances suffered, people didn't ask whether you'd made a poor investment. They asked whether you had recklessly cut a loaf after 6 p.m. In other words, it was the 19th century equivalent of blaming Mercury retrograde instead of your spending habits. In rural communities, the fear took a more practical turn. People genuinely believed that cutting bread after dark attracted bad luck that would follow you into the next day. This ranged from illness to crop failure to livestock going missing. If your cow wandered off, you didn't wonder whether the fence was broken. You wondered whether someone in the house had sliced bread under moonlight. Nothing builds trust in a family like evaluating each other's sneaky after-hours snacking habits as potential agricultural sabotage. Then there was the fear of knives themselves at night. Households believed that sharp objects used after sunset could cut the household harmony. So even if you weren't afraid of spirits, misfortune, poverty, or cosmic gluten consequences, you still had the fear of offending the delicate feng shui of your cottage. Knives were seen as objects that invited aggression or conflict, and darkness only magnified this. So cutting bread wasn't just a snack, it was a spiritual threat, a symbolic act of slicing through social peace. Somewhere in England, a man reached for a knife at 9 p.m, and his grandmother dove across the room like she was stopping a bomb detonation. Folklore in some areas even claimed that nighttime bread cutting turned the loaf hollow, draining it of its life force. Bread in the 1800s was practically treated like a pet, warm, alive, delicate, dramatic, and capable of emotional damage. Cutting it after dark supposedly caused its spirit, to leave the loaf, making it tasteless or unlucky to eat. Imagine taking a bite of bread and someone whispering, "Oh, that loaf died at 10 p.m, appetite gone." And the superstition didn't stop at slicing. Some believed that even touching bread after sunset without saying a prayer first could allow evil forces to cling to the loaf. So dinner preparation turned into a spiritual negotiation. People prayed over their crusts, whispered blessings into the dough, and treated nighttime leftovers like they were cursed archaeological artifacts. Ultimately, the fear of cutting bread after sunset reveals something deeply human about the 1800s. When life is unpredictable, food becomes symbolic. People worked from sunrise to sunset, The day was for labour, order and survival. Night was for uncertainty. Cutting bread, the simplest, most wholesome thing, symbolised stepping outside the natural rhythm. Bread wasn't just bread, it was safety, stability, a warm, delicious shield against the unknown. And after dark, that shield turned fragile. In short, in the 1800s, if you wanted toast, you'd better get it before sunset. After that, you weren't just making a snack, you were apparently scheduling a tragedy, inviting a ghost or bankrupting your household. Nighttime wasn't the right time for bread. Not because of danger, but because 19th century superstition was the original carb avoidance plan, spiritually enforced and aggressively dramatic. If you've ever stood in front of your closet thinking, "What should I wear today?" Congratulations. You're already more relaxed than the average person in the 1800s. Because in the 19th century, choosing clothing was not simply a matter of weather, comfort, or whether the laundry fairy had visited. It was a high-stakes spiritual negotiation. Every hat, button, stitch, and hemline came with cosmic implications. Forget personal expression, a shirt could accidentally doom your crops, and a mismatched pair of socks might curse you romantically for a decade. Fashion was not an aesthetic, it was a full-contact sport against the supernatural. To understand this properly, you must imagine stepping into an era where everything was changing. Trains were shrieking through the countryside, factories were turning out clothes faster than moralists could disapprove of them, and the general population was just one misplaced shoelace away from believing the world was ending. With science still wobbling on its training wheels, clothing became one of the few areas where people felt they had some control. Or rather, the illusion of control. If the universe was going to wreak havoc, at least you could make sure your coat wasn't giving it extra ideas. Let's begin with buttons, because nothing in the 1800s was too small to carry the weight of destiny. Buttons were considered the tiny gatekeepers of fortune, miniature shields stitched to your chest. If one fell off unexpectedly, it wasn't just a wardrobe malfunction, it was a sign that fate had opinions about your week. A lost button on the right side meant financial troubles. A lost button on the left meant romantic betrayal. A lost button at the bottom meant absolutely anything, because no one could agree on the symbolism, but they all agreed something terrible was coming. People hoarded extra buttons in jars, drawers, coat pockets, and occasionally their mouths during rushed sewing emergencies. It was considered better to be caught without your manners than without your backup button supply. Then there were hats, the unofficial traffic lights of destiny. Hats determined everything from social rank to whether you'd have a lucky journey. Placing your hat on the bed, oh, the catastrophe. According to 19th century superstition, placing a hat on any sleeping surface was basically sending an engraved invitation to bad luck. You might as well write, "Dear misfortune, please visit my household at your earliest convenience. We have tea." Hats were also never to be placed brim down, as this was believed to seal your fortune, much like a spiritual teapot. The hat's job was to collect blessings, not pour them all over the floorboards like an idiot. Speaking of blessings, hems were the 1800s equivalent of life insurance. Women in particular believed that a properly sewn hem protected them from illness, gossip, and wandering spirits. Three things that plagued the century with equal enthusiasm. If your hem was crooked, it meant trouble. If it frayed, it predicted heartbreak. If it came undone in public, well, you might as well accept that the universe was personally mocking you. Tailors knew this and often became part-time therapists, reassuring anxious clients that a hem could be lengthened, but did not necessarily lengthen their suffering. Colour, of course, had its own language, one no rational person ever fully understood, but everyone politely panicked about. Blue was considered a protective colour, perfect for warding off envy, illness, or nosy relatives. Green was lucky only if worn on Thursdays and never if worn at weddings, unless you enjoyed living dangerously. Yellow predicted betrayal, which was awkward, because it also happened to be fashionable during certain decades. Wearing black when you weren't mourning was thought to confuse spirits, potentially luring unwelcome souls who assumed you were grieving and therefore emotionally vulnerable. But the real chaos, pure unfiltered superstition, arrived with inside-out clothing. In the 1800s, accidentally putting your shirt on inside out was not considered the result of being half asleep or having poor lighting. It was a sign of cosmic intervention. You were supposed to leave it that way for the rest of the day for good luck. Changing it back was believed to reverse your fortune and anger guardian spirits. So if you walked into a shop and saw a gentleman browsing the goods with his waistcoat seams proudly facing the world, don't judge. He wasn't eccentric. He was spiritually committed. Shoes were equally intense. Wearing mismatched shoes was a sign of impending romance or impending disaster. People usually couldn't remember which, but either way it caused a stir. Dropping a shoe meant someone was speaking poorly of you, tying your shoe too tightly meant you were binding your fortune, whatever that meant. And if you gave someone a pair of shoes as a gift, they were obligated to pay you at least 1 coin, otherwise the relationship would walk away. Receiving shoes for free was seen as a cosmic insult, as if the giver was silently saying, "I hope you wander aimlessly forever." Even threads and stitches held spiritual meaning. A tangled thread during sewing predicted a surprise visitor. A knot forming on its own was a warning of future arguments. Accidentally pricking your finger on a needle meant you'd soon hear gossip, usually about yourself. Because the Victorians thrived on drama even the spirits allegedly indulged in. The result was a century where getting dressed took mental fortitude. You weren't just choosing clothes, you were buttons in the 1800s were small, circular objects capable of doing everything except their actual job, staying attached. You could buy a brand new jacket, blink twice, and suddenly half your buttons were missing, lost to the wind, the floorboards, or the mysterious void where all Victorian objects went to die. But despite their tendency to escape, buttons were treated with the reverence of holy relics and the suspicion usually reserved for suspiciously quiet toddlers. Victorians believed these tiny items possessed luck, protection, and spiritual muscle, even if no one openly admitted it. After all, no respectable adult wanted to confess that they trusted a 1-inch piece of bone more than their doctor, their priest, or their cousin who claimed to have visions. Buttons weren't just fasteners, they were talismans, affordable, portable insurance policies against a universe that clearly enjoyed chaos. Many households kept a button tin, which was both a storage container and unintentionally a time capsule of stress. Inside, you might find mismatched buttons from every decade, one silver button that nobody remembered buying, a handful of wooden ones worn down like they'd fought in a war, and at least 2 mysterious metal ones that absolutely didn't belong to anyone in the family. Victorians loved to pretend they only collected these for sewing emergencies. In truth, they were stockpiling spiritual backup. One common belief was that a spare button carried in your pocket acted like a charm protecting you from misfortune, especially during travel. Trains were new, horses were unpredictable, and carriages had the structural integrity of a cardboard box tied together with hope. So naturally, people decided the safest solution was carry a button. A wooden button meant protection from thieves, a brass one meant safe travel, a bone one meant at least you won't die today. Even rational educated people would pat their pockets before a long journey, not to check their money, but to confirm they had their lucky button. Nothing says confidence like trusting your life to a sewing notion. Buttons also became tools of emotion, affection, and passive-aggressive communication. Giving someone a button was the 1800s equivalent of handing them a personal bodyguard. It meant, I want you protected, but I cannot say that aloud because this is the Victorian era and emotions are forbidden. Lovers exchanged buttons when actual gifts were too suspicious or too expressive. Friends gave each other good fortune buttons before exams, first jobs, or questionable social visits. Parents secretly slipped buttons into children's pockets, sometimes so many that the child jingled like a haunted maraca. Even more dramatic were the button sewing rituals. Victorians believed that sewing a button with a crooked stitch could confuse evil spirits. The logic was simple. If malevolent forces approached, they'd see the sloppy sewing and think, absolutely not, this family has enough problems, and leave immediately. Others believed sewing buttons on in odd numbers created a protective pattern. 1, 3, 5, while even numbers invited danger. Did this help anyone? Historically, no, but did Victorians cling to it anyway? Absolutely. Then there were the truly secretive practices, rituals people pretended not to believe in, but absolutely performed when no one was watching. A popular one was the wish button. If you needed a bit of luck, you plucked a button from your clothing, whispered your wish into it quietly because your neighbours already thought you were strange, and placed it under your pillow. If the wish came true, the button was sewn back with a gratitude knot. If it didn't, the button was banished to the bottom of the button tin, the Victorian form of time out. Buttons even played a role in business. Many shopkeepers kept a button near the till for prosperity, believing that losing the button meant losing customers. Tailors often kept a jar of buttons not just for repairs but for protection, especially from angry clients who didn't understand that measuring inseams was a dangerous profession. And of course, buttons appeared in fortune-telling. Some women practiced button casting, dropping a handful onto the table and interpreting the patterns like tea leaves. A circle shape meant luck, a straight line meant travel, a cluster meant gossip, and a lone button meant someone had a crush or someone had lost a button. In Victorian life, both were equally likely. By the late 1800s, button superstitions remained strong despite rising education, scientific advancements, and sewing machine improvements. People publicly rolled their eyes at these beliefs while privately sewing a protection button onto their child's collar. Because in a century filled with disease, industrial accidents, haunted-looking portraits, and unpredictable household stoves, a button was something small, simple, and reassuring. The good news, you had a spare button. The bad news, now you had to remember which superstition it was supposed to help with. If the 1800s had a mascot, it would be a hat. Big hats, tiny hats, hats with ribbons, hats with feathers, hats heavy enough to qualify as upper body workouts. But beneath the fashion lay something deeper. Terror. Hats were not just clothing, they were omens, warnings, and spiritual barometers. One wrong movement, and you weren't simply making a fashion mistake, you were summoning disaster. It was like living inside a horror film produced by a milliner. The most widespread belief was that placing a hat on a bed was practically begging for death. Not rumours, not sickness, death. Entire households froze in panic if a hat accidentally touched a mattress. Someone would gasp, someone else would mutter a prayer, and the most dramatic relative would faint into the nearest set of curtains. People believed beds were liminal spaces, places where souls lingered, dreams roamed, and hats definitely did not belong. Returning a hat to its proper hook became a sacred ritual, performed carefully, reverently, and often with muttered apologies to whichever spirits were listening. Then there were the rules about removing your hat. Take it off too quickly and you invited bad fortune. Take it off too slowly and you insulted whatever higher powers governed social etiquette. Removing a hat indoors had to be done like performing delicate surgery. Smooth, precise, and without panic. Victorians believed that hats held onto a person's essence, and removing it incorrectly might let misfortune slip in. In other words, your hat, not your hygiene or decisions, was responsible for the state of your life. A hat falling on its own was the biggest warning sign of all. If your hat plopped to the floor without being touched, you weren't supposed to ask whether it was a draft or poor craftsmanship. You were supposed to prepare your funeral outfit. People interpreted falling hats as signs of approaching death, betrayal, or calamity. Even the bravest men, the kind who'd walk into a coal mine without blinking, became uneasy if their hat tipped forward unexpectedly. After all, in their minds, a falling hat was the supernatural equivalent of someone whispering good luck to you'll need it. Women weren't exempt from this paranoia. For them, hat ribbons held their own danger. If a ribbon came loose while you were walking, some believed it meant bad news was travelling toward you. If the ribbon fell off entirely, people assumed someone close to you was in trouble. This is why Victorian women often tied their hat ribbons with the strength of a sailor securing a ship mast. They weren't about to let a silk bow announce misfortune on their behalf. There was also a popular belief that borrowing someone's hat meant borrowing their luck or their misfortune. So naturally, families had unspoken rules. You didn't lend your hat to a cousin having a streak of bad luck because you didn't want whatever was haunting them to hitch a ride. You didn't borrow a hat from someone whose life seemed suspiciously perfect because perfection was unnatural and clearly a sign the hat was cursed. The safest solution was simple. Wear your own hat and hope the universe didn't take offence. Hat turning had its own set of rules too. Turning a hat upside down was believed to let the luck spill out. As a result, professional men treated their hats with the same precision as accountants handle ledgers. Children were repeatedly scolded for flipping hats during play. Adults didn't care about mud on the carpet, but the moment a child placed a hat upside down, an uncle somewhere gasped dramatically. A more unusual superstition surrounded the inside lining of hats. Some believed writing a secret blessing inside the hatband protected the wearer from harm. Others stitched small symbols or religious initials into the lining, convinced it strengthened their moral character. These weren't visible to the public. This was private spiritual millinery. Even the toughest dock workers sometimes carried hats lined with protective charms, just in case the universe felt particularly spiteful that day. Yet perhaps the strangest belief was that a new hat changed your fate. Buying one was not simply a fashion decision, it was a life event. People believed a new hat could shift fortunes, attract opportunities, or start a new cycle of luck. Milliners understood this and subtly encouraged customers with phrases like, "This one will bring good things." It was half sales pitch, half spiritual prophecy. By the end of the 1800s, hat superstitions remained deeply rooted, quietly shaping behaviour, etiquette, and fashion choices. People pretended they didn't believe these things, but if a hat slipped, fell, or tilted the wrong way, even the most rational Victorian would give it a nervous glance. Because in a world where everything felt uncertain, from weather to illness to economics, it was comforting to believe your life could be managed by something as simple as a well-behaved hat. The good news, you had a hat. The bad news, it had opinions. If you want to understand pure Victorian anxiety distilled into one household rule, here it is. Under any circumstances, put new shoes on a table. Forget politics, disease, or urban pollution. Nothing in the 1800s could destabilize a household faster than the sight of fresh resting where people ate their porridge. A single misplaced shoe could trigger outrage, fear, heated family debates, and possibly a neighbour sprinting across the street to scream, "Take it off, take it off." This superstition was so aggressively believed that even people who claimed to be modern thinkers refused to challenge it. Shoes on a table weren't just unlucky, they were practically an invitation for fate to swing by and ruin your entire week. To understand why this particular rule held such terrifying power, we have to remember what shoes were in the 19th century. They were survivors. They marched through mud, manure, factory dust, horse droppings, puddles of unknown origin, and the sort of urban grime that would make a germaphobe pass out on sight. A shoe was a walking crime scene. So the idea of putting one on a table, where food touched surfaces and mouths touched food, was seen as both spiritually and hygienically catastrophic. Of course, the Victorians didn't phrase it as hygiene. That would imply a love of science. Instead, they phrased it as, "If you put new shoes on a table, death will come to collect his weekly subscription." Interestingly, the superstition only applied to new shoes. The logic? New shoes were associated with major life events, births, weddings, funerals, and I finally saved enough money to not be barefoot anymore rites of passage. They carried symbolic meaning, and if you placed that symbol on a table, Victorians believed you disrupted the delicate cosmic balance between celebration and doom. New shoes belonged on feet, shelves, or under the bed where monsters lived, not on the household altar known as the dinner table. Even thinking about placing them there was considered risky, like calling upon spirits just to see if they were busy. Working-class households especially clung to this superstition with an emotional grip, usually reserved for family heirlooms. Shoes were expensive, sometimes the most expensive item a household owned besides the bed. People saved for them, protected them, polished them, and bragged about them. Putting such a valuable object somewhere as vulnerable as a table was not only bad luck, it was borderline disrespectful to the shoe. Victorians almost treated footwear like moody pets. If you offended them, they would curse your crops, spoil your dinner, or make your hair misbehave until you learned your lesson. Families developed elaborate strategies to ensure shoes never once grazed a table surface. Mothers gave lectures, fathers gave threats. Children were trained like circus performers to balance shoe boxes on the tips of their fingers rather than risk setting them down in the wrong place. A shoe on a table accident could spark hours of cleaning rituals, frantic hand-washing, and whispered prayers. Think of it as the Victorian version of accidentally hitting reply all. The fallout was immediate and unforgettable. The superstition also played into one of the era's favourite psychological pastimes, blaming misfortune on anything except the real cause. If the bread didn't rise, someone must have put shoes too close to the kitchen table last week. If a cow stopped producing milk, it probably overheard someone joke about placing boots on a counter. If Uncle Henry got a cold, it certainly wasn't due to the fact that he stood in the rain for 3 hours telling a stranger his opinions on politics. It was the shoes. Always the shoes. And if your hairstyle refused to cooperate, shoes. Hidden, lurking, vindictive shoes. In mining towns, factory districts, and rural farms, the superstition took on an even more dramatic edge. People claimed that shoes on a table invited workplace accidents, machinery failures, or livestock illness. One miner swore that the tragic collapse of Tunnel Number 3 began the very same morning his son Bull tossed a shiny new pair of boots onto the kitchen table for just 1 second. That's how fast the superstition could spread. One unlucky moment could explain disasters miles away. Even wealthier households weren't exempt from this belief. In elegant Victorian homes, where shoes were polished enough to blind you, the idea remained just as firm. Servants were strictly instructed never to unpack footwear near a dining area, and if a boot even looked at the table suspiciously, someone lifted a cross, muttered a prayer, or threw a napkin over it as if smothering a scandal. Homes were filled with elaborate rules, but no shoes on the table stood out because it united every class. This was one superstition everyone agreed on, right up there with "don't anger the goose before Christmas." Perhaps the funniest part is that, much like other superstitions of the time, Victorians invented follow-up solutions. If someone accidentally placed shoes on a table, they had a series of emergency remedies. Knock the shoes on the floor 3 times, turn around twice, spit discreetly over your left shoulder, or burn a tiny scrap of cloth near the hearth to scare away bad spirits. Imagine the chaos. A household performing a spontaneous ritual because someone got distracted for 2 seconds and set down their boots during dinner prep. In short, the Victorians believed shoes on a table were not just unsanitary or rude, they were cosmic invitations for chaos. The table was the heart of the household. Shoes were the feet of the household, and placing the feet on the heart, that, in their minds, was how families died. Crops withered, storms formed, and hair refused to curl properly. Shoes didn't just walk, they judged, cursed, punished, and occasionally ruined your entire autumn. If you've ever put on a slightly too tight waistband and thought, "Wow, this feels cursed," congratulations. You now understand exactly how people in the 1800s felt about corsets. Except in their case, they believed that tightening a corset too much didn't just ruin your comfort, it ruined your destiny. To the 19th century mind, a corset wasn't simply a garment, it was a spiritual contract. Lace it incorrectly and you might upset the spirits, doom your marriage, curse your unborn children, or accidentally announce to the entire universe that you were inviting misfortune over for tea. Corsets in the 1800s were already controversial for medical and moral reasons. Doctors claimed they squeezed organs like bellows. Moralists insisted they encouraged vanity. Mothers warned that wearing one too early would seal your fate, which is a very dramatic way of saying you'll walk funny for a few hours. But under all these noisy opinions lived a thriving underground of superstitions that made the garment feel less like lingerie and more like a magical device that required careful, sometimes absurd rituals. One common belief was that lacing a corset too tightly trapped not just your lungs, but spirits. Yes, spirits. Apparently, the ghosts lingering around your home were not only judgmental, but very concerned about your tailoring choices. If you yanked the laces too hard, people feared it created a binding knot that could anger ancestral spirits or invite wandering entities who thought you were signalling for help. Imagine trying to explain to a Victorian ghost that you weren't summoning them. You were simply trying to achieve an hourglass figure without fainting before breakfast. Another popular fear revolved around marriage. A corset that was tied in a crooked pattern supposedly brought emotional chaos, marital arguments, or, in extreme superstition, a doomed wedding. Young women were told that lacing a corset in the wrong order could twist a husband's affections, which is a poetic way of saying that if your marriage went badly, your underwear was to blame. Forget communication, emotional compatibility, or financial strain. No, your corset just sent the wrong message to the universe. The marriage curse went deeper. Some households swore that a corset tightened past a certain point created pressure on fortune, meaning you were literally squeezing out your future luck. The tighter the corset, the more you squeezed your blessings away. So while you were trying not to pass out from lack of oxygen at a social gathering, half the room silently assumed you were shrinking your romantic prospects with every breath you couldn't take. Fashion was suffering, but it was also apparently witchcraft. And then there was the superstition that a poorly tied corset could curse future children, even children you didn't plan on having. If the knot was tied backward, some believed it would reverse the womb's fortunes, making childbirth difficult or causing the child's spirit to become restless or confused. This is easily one of the rare moments in history where a piece of clothing was accused of creating personality problems for people who didn't even exist yet. Imagine a Victorian mother saying, "Your bad attitude comes from the time I tied my corset incorrectly at age 16. Therapy bills today would be unimaginable. The superstitions weren't always doom-filled. Some households believed a properly tied corset served as protection, a kind of fabric shield. A neat, balanced knot meant harmony. Daily tightening rituals were done facing certain directions, or after murmuring quick good luck phrases, almost like a personal prayer that doubled as shapewear management. Others avoided lacing corsets on rainy days because the dampness might trap melancholic air, which could seep into one's emotions. In other words, the Victorians blamed their bad moods on humidity and underwear simultaneously, a level of multitasking we should admire. There were also strict rules about who was allowed to tie your corset. Letting a jealous friend lace you up supposedly gave them the power to bind your beauty, causing illness or social misfortune. A spiteful servant could sabotage your luck with a single tug. Some people only trusted sisters or mothers to do the tying to ensure affectionate hands shaped the day's destiny. If anyone else touched the laces, they feared their energy, good or bad, would seep into the threads and alter the wearer's fate. Corset superstitions grew even more intense during the important life events. Before a wedding, some families insisted on a special knot pattern known as a binding of blessing, tied slowly and ceremonially, while reciting verses meant to protect the bride from envy or unseen forces. During mourning periods, others avoided wearing new corsets altogether, believing the fresh fabric might not yet be spiritually neutral and could invite unwanted ghosts from the household being remembered. And then there was the nighttime rule: never hang your corset on the bedpost. This was said to attract mischievous spirits who would play with the strings and tangle your fate. Women swore they woke with knots mysteriously altered from how they left them, blaming not open windows, not restless pets, but paranormal fashion critics. By the end of the century, many of these beliefs began to fade, though not entirely. Even the least superstitious Victorians might whisper warnings like, "Don't lace too tightly or you'll invite trouble," mixing leftover folklore with half-hearted medical advice. And while modern corsets no longer come with supernatural disclaimers, the 1800s made sure one thing was clear. Shaping your waist was serious business. Very serious. Life-altering. Ghost-summoning serious. So the next time you wear anything uncomfortable for the sake of appearance, Remember, at least no one today thinks your belt is cursing your relationships. The good news, your outfit won't hex your future. The bad news, in the 1800s people absolutely believed it could. If you've ever cracked open a window at night because your room felt a bit stuffy, congratulations, you would have been arrested by 19th century society for reckless endangerment. To Victorians, sleeping with fresh air wasn't healthy, refreshing or sane. It was practically an invitation for death, illness, ghosts, and whatever malicious airborne force was lurking outside waiting for its big moment. The 1800s were a time when people believed two contradictory things at once, that nature was beautiful and that it was trying to murder them. Trees were lovely during daytime strolls. At night, they became oxygen-sucking demons producing toxic night air. Night air was the celebrity villain of the era, feared, respected and blamed for absolutely everything. If a person woke up coughing, trembling, sweating or just existing slightly wrong, the diagnosis was unanimous. Ah yes, the night air is attacked. You'd think this invisible menace had a schedule too, because it was completely harmless at 4 p.m, but transformed into a serial killer by sundown. The science behind this? Absolutely none. But fear? Plentiful. Anxiety in the 1800s wasn't a disorder. It was a lifestyle. Miasma theory played a starring role in this nightly terror. If you mentioned miasma to a Victorian, they'd nod solemnly as if you'd just cited the highest authority in the universe. Miasma was believed to be poisonous vapours floating through the air, carrying disease like invisible assassins. That meant any open window invited these vapours inside, and once they entered, good luck escaping. Victorians genuinely believed their bedrooms were safer as airtight boxes, where breathing became optional. If it came down to suffocate slowly inside a sealed room or crack a window and let the night murder you, they proudly chose suffocation. The bedtime ritual of sealing windows was like preparing for a siege. Heavy curtains were pulled shut, stuffed towels were jammed into cracks, shutters were locked, and any small opening was treated like an entry point for the apocalypse. Some households took it further, using wax, cloth soaked in vinegar, or even small boards nailed over window frames, because nothing screams sound sleep, like imprisoning yourself in your own bedroom. They weren't just avoiding breezes, they were building fortresses. And if you dared open a window, oh, the social shame. It wasn't just considered risky, it was considered irresponsible, morally questionable, and downright unpatriotic. In the 1800s, people were obsessed with judgment, and nothing triggered gossip faster than a neighbour who slept with their window open. Did you hear? She lets the night air in. Cue gasps, clutching of pearls, and a one person fainting for the dramatic effect. Keeping windows shut wasn't simply a health decision. It was a reputation management strategy. Doctors supported the paranoia too, because many of them didn't know what they were doing. Their medical advice often came from a blend of guesswork, folk superstition, and whatever sounded terrifying enough to keep patients obedient. Physicians warned that night air caused tuberculosis, pneumonia, brain fever, and even unnatural excitability, which sounds suspiciously like having a personality after 8 p.m. The result? Bedrooms became thermal prisons where people sweated, suffocated, and proudly believed this was proof of their moral fortitude. Victorian parents took things to extremes when children were involved. Babies were swaddled, blanketed, cocooned, and tucked into beds that had the airflow of a sealed jar. If a child woke up cranky, which all children do, the explanation was simple. The night air must have lingered under the door. Parents bragged about how little fresh air their infant received, as if it were a competitive sport. Oh, your child slept with the window cracked. Mine slept in a room so sealed even light couldn't escape. But the fear wasn't limited to illness. Oh no. The night air had spiritual implications. Many believed that nighttime winds carried spirits searching for open windows to slip through, because apparently ghosts followed the same logic as raccoons. If the window was open, that meant you were practically begging for a spectral roommate who didn't pay rent and rearranged your furniture. Some believed witches rode on drafts and could slip through the slightest gap in a window frame. Cold air wasn't just cold air, it was supernatural transit. People even believed the night air had moral judgments. If you slept with a window open, you were lazy, irresponsible, or inviting temptation, which is vague Victorian speak for you're behaving suspiciously and we don't like it. Curtains were praised, not for beauty, but for their defensive power. They were basically spiritual riot shields. Bedrooms were arranged to avoid proximity to windows, beds were placed in corners far from potential breezes, and if all else failed, people relied on thick nightcaps to protect their heads from cold, evil influences. To Victorians, nighttime didn't simply mean darkness, it meant vulnerability. Yet ironically, the very thing they feared was the thing they needed most. Lack of ventilation led to headaches, respiratory problems, and miserable sleep. But if you mentioned this, Victorians insisted you simply weren't strong enough to handle the wholesome stillness of nighttime air. They treated stale bedroom air like a vitamin supplement. In the end, 1800s sleeping habits weren't about safety or health. They were about fear of invisible dangers, misunderstood science, and the uncomfortable feeling that the outside world might slip inside when they weren't looking. And so they sealed themselves tight, slept hot and miserable, and congratulated themselves for surviving yet another night without being poisoned by nature. The good news, you lived through the night. The bad news, so did the stale air you shared it with. Sleeping in the 1800s was already an Olympic-level challenge. No fans, no AC, mysterious household noises, and the constant Victorian belief that the night was basically a buffet for spirits, illness, and the air that judges you. But just when you think lying down should be the easiest part of surviving the century, the Victorians introduced rules, lots of rules, about where, how, and in what direction your pillow should be placed. Because, of course, they did. If there was one thing 19th century people enjoyed more than anxiety, it was assigning deep symbolism to inanimate objects, including the humble rectangle of feathers meant to keep your head from hitting cold wood. Pillow placement wasn't a preference, it was a moral performance. The wrong placement might invite illness, loneliness, gossip, poor crops, a disappointing marriage, or the sudden appearance of an unwanted suitor at your door. Nothing says romance like being summoned by someone's incorrectly positioned bedding. In the Victorian imagination, pillows weren't just tools for comfort. They were tiny spiritual traffic signs, quietly directing the universe. You weren't just going to sleep. You were negotiating with fate. At the heart of Victorian pillow superstition was the belief that the head was the body's most vulnerable entry point. Not to physical injury, they could handle bumps, scrapes, and the occasional runaway carriage wheel to the shin. No, the head was vulnerable to invisible forces, spirits, bad luck, wandering souls, and dreams so intense they were considered pre-hauntings. Your pillow, therefore, acted like a gatekeeper. If it faced the wrong direction, you had essentially left your spiritual back door open and hung a sign that said, "Please enter, snacks in the kitchen." For many households, the most important rule was never sleep with your pillow facing north. North, in Victorian cosmology, was the direction of cold, death, and general unpleasantness. Think of it as the cosmic "do not disturb" sign for the living. People believed that sleeping with your head pointing north aligned you with the orientation of the dead in burial grounds, which meant you were basically practicing being a corpse. Doing it accidentally was bad enough. Doing it deliberately meant you were inviting fate to speed up your cemetery reservation. Then there was the rule about pillow symmetry. Your pillows couldn't be crooked, diagonal, or suspiciously tilted. A misaligned pillow meant misaligned fortune, business failures, arguments, unexpected bills, or a horse refusing to cooperate at the worst possible moment. In other words, if your pillow looked even a little uncommitted, your entire week was doomed. Some people even pressed their pillows like shirts, not to make them comfortable, but to keep them morally straight. The 1800s, where the crispness of your bedding apparently affected your creditworthiness. And heaven help anyone who accidentally placed a pillow with the open end facing the bedroom door. This was thought to invite strangers, troublemakers, and suitors with questionable facial hair. In particular, unmarried women were warned that such reckless pillow angling might call forth a man of unsuitable reputation, which is Victorian code for a man who doesn't own property, speaks casually in public, or wears his hat at a jaunty angle. Mothers would walk into bedrooms like crime inspectors, flipping pillows around with the urgency of someone defusing a bomb. Pillow open toward the door? Congratulations, you've just summoned the Victorian equivalent of a walking red flag. But one of the strangest superstitions involved sleeping with the pillow at the foot of the bed. This was said to reverse your luck, flip your dreams upside down, and confuse your guardian spirit. If the universe was a carefully arranged filing system, turning your pillow the wrong way was like switching labels around just to watch fate panic. People insisted this position caused bizarre dreams, ones involving upside-down landscapes, inverted conversations, and occasionally ostentatious chickens. Victorians deeply respected dreams. They did not respect confusion. Therefore, the foot-of-bed pillow was treated like a dare from the supernatural realm. There were also rules about pillow fluffing. Fluff too aggressively, and you stirred spiritual dust, unlucky. Fluff too softly, and you didn't activate the protective energy within the feathers. Yes, feathers apparently had energy. Victorians never met an object they couldn't spiritualize. Some believed a pillow needed exactly 3 fluffs before bed. 2 meant bad sleep. 4 meant you were teasing the spirits with extra air. If you lost count, that was it. Restart your life. Another surprisingly common belief: do not sleep with embroidered pillows unless the embroidery is friendly. Friendly embroidery consisted of flowers, initials, or geometric patterns. Unfriendly embroidery involved birds, too symbolic, eyes, way too symbolic, or angels, dangerously symbolic, because the Victorians were convinced angels monitored everything like extremely judgmental mall security guards. Sleeping on embroidered angels without moral justification could bring nightmares or random scolding from elderly relatives. Finally, pillows were believed to remember your mood. Yes, they carried emotional residue. If you went to bed angry, it was said your pillow would trap that anger like a grudge-holding marshmallow and release it upon you the following night. To avoid this, some people whispered apologies to their pillows or smoothed them gently, as if reassuring a sensitive pet. Historians have found 0 evidence this worked, but plenty of evidence that Victorians were exhausted. In the end, Victorian pillow rules reveal something universal. Humans will do anything to feel in control, especially in a time when illness, danger, and surprise were everyday companions. And if that means treating your pillow like a delicate cosmic radio antenna, well, grab your fluffing hand, you've got fate to manage. In an era when people genuinely thought eggs could predict your future, soup could read your mood, and hats behave like emotional landmines. It should surprise no one that bedtime came with its own catalogue of absolute panic. Among the most terrifying sleep-related rules of the 1800s was this: never, under any circumstances, sleep with your feet face the door. If you did, you weren't just asking for trouble, You were basically penciling yourself onto the Grim Reaper's Google Calendar, and he did not respect rescheduling requests. To the modern eye, a bed facing a door just makes sense. You see the entrance, you monitor threats. You keep an eye on your cat plotting its midnight crimes. But to a 19th century household, positioning your feet toward the door wasn't just bad feng shui, it was practically a spiritual invitation. In their worldview, the door wasn't simply the way in and out of the room. It was a threshold between worlds, a corridor connecting the polite Victorian universe and whatever lurked in the shadowy after-hours dimension, where spirits, thieves, and assorted supernatural freeloaders lived. The first and most widespread fear was the death door theory. This superstition claimed that sleeping with your feet pointing at the door mimicked a corpse being carried out of a room feet first, the traditional method used in funerals. In the 1800s, as soon as someone died, the undertaker's assistants would grab the body by the feet and haul it out, toes leading the way like grim little directional arrows. So if you drifted off with your feet pointed toward the door, you were basically aligning yourself with corpse logistics. In their minds, even death had a sense of efficiency. Why waste time looking for a new victim when someone had already helpfully assumed the exit position? This belief was so powerful that families rearranged entire bedrooms to avoid it. Bed too big? Door too inconveniently placed? Too bad. You either slept sideways like an exhausted shrimp or pushed the entire bed frame across the room with the combined force of 3 uncles. Victorian households treated bed placement like a tactical war map. When visitors found themselves assigned to a guest room, half the conversation before bedtime was spent asking, "Is this orientation safe? Or am I going to get spiritually mugged at 2 a.m? The second major fear was spirit abduction. According to folklore, wandering entities, ghosts, demons, disgruntled ancestors, or possibly just bored nighttime gremlins, preferred to enter through doorways, floating in like judgmental mist. If your feet pointed at the entrance, you were in the perfect position for a supernatural snatch and grab. The Victorians truly believed that spirits behaved like opportunistic raccoons. If the door was open and the target was conveniently aligned, they'd help themselves. People particularly dreaded the toe pull, a horrifying concept where a spirit would yank on your feet to drag your soul, or worse, your entire body, into the ghostly beyond. Many households told bedtime stories about relatives who had tempted fate by sleeping in the wrong direction and were found the next morning pale, shaken, and absolutely convinced the other side had tried to collect them like overdue library books. Whether these stories were real or the result of indigestion plus imagination will remain one of history's great mysteries. And then, of course, came the criminal explanation. Because in the 1800s, crime wasn't just a possibility, it was entertainment. Thieves were thought to enter quietly at night, scanning rooms for vulnerable sleepers. According to superstition, if your feet faced the door, you were visually aligned with the exit, and more likely to be dragged out of bed by intruders who presumably had both upper body strength and zero respect for boundaries. Was this logistically practical? Not at all. But logic was optional in the 1800s, and fear was always on sale. For many Victorians, resisting this superstition wasn't worth the anxiety, so they developed prevention strategies more dramatic than the superstition itself. Some households installed furniture barricades like they were preparing for a mild siege. Others angled their beds diagonally, ignoring the fact that this made the room look like a crime scene. Parents trained children early. Never sleep pointing toward the door, dear, unless you want the boogeyman to use you as a welcome mat. It was the kind of sentence that guaranteed nightmares and ensured compliance. Even travel accommodations weren't say-ins, and boarding houses included handwritten notes reminding guests to rotate their bedrolls for spiritual safety. And if a room was poorly designed, the innkeeper would assure visitors that local spirits aren't very strong this season. Nothing says relaxation like being told ghosts have seasonal moods. Perhaps the most extraordinary part of this superstition is that it reveals just how deeply Victorians believed in invisible threats. To them, the night was filled with dangers waiting to slip under the door: illness, spirits, cold draughts near, an existential dread wrapped in superstition. Sleeping was supposed to be restful, but in the 1800s, it was practically a team sport. Part strategy, part prayer, part interior design challenge. The modern world may worry about screen time, blue light and bad mattresses, but at least we no longer fear being spiritually kidnapped by improper furniture placement. In the 19th century, however, the bedroom door wasn't simply a door. It was an omen, a warning, and an existential hazard all at once. And so the Victorians slept curled sideways, diagonally, or in any direction that wasn't toward that ominous rectangular portal. Because the good news was you were safe, for now. The bad news? Death had a very good sense of direction. If you've ever woken up from a dream thinking, "What on earth was that?" Congratulations, you already have something in common with the people of the 1800s. The difference is that while you might shrug and move on with your day, the Victorians absolutely did not. In the 19th century, dreams were not just inconvenient late-night entertainment for the subconscious. They were spiritual message boards, cosmic newsletters, divine warnings, and most importantly, free fortune-telling that didn't require paying a travelling mystic who smelled like incense and questionable hope. People were convinced that their nightly visions held the power to predict their luck, relationships, reputation, and occasionally whether their neighbour was plotting something sinister. And surprisingly, nothing appeared in dreams more often, or more symbolically, than food. The 1800s had a dream dictionary for nearly everything, but vegetables and meats seemed to possess a special cosmic authority. Dreaming of onions, for instance, was practically a cinematic trailer for drama. According to dream guides of the time, an onion in your sleep foretold gossip, quarrels, jealousy, or a dramatic social unravelling. One guide even warned that an onion seen whole or peeled or sprouting indicates that tongues will wag. Yes, merely slicing onions in real life made you cry, but slicing them in a dream meant people would be crying about you. This belief took hold so deeply that some Victorians refused to cook onions after sunset, fearing they might appear in dreams and ruin the rest of their week. Meanwhile, dreaming of bacon, of all things, was considered a magnificent sign. If strips of pork danced through your slumber, it meant prosperity, unexpected gifts, or general good fortune. Bacon symbolised abundance because it took time, labour, and resources to cure properly. If you were dreaming of it, it meant your subconscious was basically announcing, "Congratulations, your financial life may briefly stop being a crisis." In a century where most people couldn't predict their income from one month to the next, even dreaming of breakfast was treated like an early Christmas bonus. Some dream manuals went so far as to say that bacon sizzling in a dream promised a favourable turning of circumstances, which is a poetic way of saying, relax, the universe finally decided to help you. Bread also played a starring role in dream interpretations. While bread in waking life already carried moral meaning, as discussed earlier, don't worry, we're not repeating details. In dreams, it meant something entirely separate. Marriage. Fresh bread predicted a hopeful union, stale bread meant a cautious courtship, and burned bread suggested a relationship doomed from the start. It's almost touching that Victorians saw romance in carbohydrates. They truly believed that a dream about a bun or loaf meant your love life was rising, figuratively, of course. One dream book even recommended placing a piece of bread under your pillow to encourage visions of partnership, as if encouraging yeast-based matchmaking was a perfectly normal bedtime activity. Vegetables and meats weren't the only items with prophetic reputations. Dreaming of cabbage meant approaching disappointment, but oddly, dreaming of preparing cabbage meant financial opportunity. Victorians loved to create distinctions so tiny that one wonders if dream interpreters were being paid by the word. Carrots foretold health and longevity. Cucumbers suggested upcoming quarrels. Peas symbolised new beginnings, and potatoes predicted improvement of circumstances. In the dream world of the 1800s, your garden was basically running your social calendar. It didn't stop there. If you dreamed of fish, people believed secrets were about to be exposed, especially your own. Dreaming of apples suggested knowledge, but dreaming of rotten apples meant someone close to you was plotting. Dreaming of cake, expect celebration. Dreaming of eating cake, expect losing money. Dreaming of baking cake, expect nothing but exhaustion, because even dream logic couldn't hide the fact that baking in the 1800s was an upper body workout. What makes these beliefs truly fascinating is not that they existed. Cultures everywhere have dream lore, but how seriously people treated them. It wasn't uncommon for someone to delay a marriage proposal because they dreamed of green beans the night before. Families argued over whether a dream about boiling potatoes was a warning or a blessing. Housewives consulted dream dictionaries like modern people consult weather apps. Should we travel tomorrow? Well, last night I dreamed of slicing a lemon, so no. Even nightmares carried their own set of meanings. Dreaming of an empty table meant scarcity. Dreaming of a full one meant unexpected guests. And not just any guests, annoying ones, the kind who stay for days and insist on telling you about their health problems. Some believed dreaming of cooking meant you were wasting your energy on ungrateful people. Others insisted that dreaming of eating alone meant betrayal. Nighttime was not restful. Your brain was too busy sending coded, grocery-themed messages that people felt obligated to decode. Naturally, These dream beliefs blended awkwardly, but enthusiastically, with religion, early psychology, and folk magic. Ministers warned against over-interpreting dreams, but also offered sermons explaining symbolic visions. Folk healers created lists of lucky dreams and unlucky dreams, sometimes selling charms to enhance the former and cancel out the latter. And early psychologists of the era, armed with absolutely no understanding of how brains work, published thick, confident books explaining why dreaming of carrots revealed your moral character. Freud wasn't around yet, but if he had been, he wouldn't have known whether to laugh or cry. By the end of the century, dream symbolism became a full cultural pastime. Gift shops sold dream dictionaries. Newspapers printed dream interpretation columns. Even Queen Victoria was rumoured to be interested in symbolic dreams, though one suspects she never admitted to dreaming of onions predicting palace gossip. In the end, this entire belief system reveals something charmingly human. When life felt unpredictable, people searched for meaning in the most harmless place they could, their own dreams. And if that meaning came in the form of a prophetic carrot or a message from a loaf of bread, so be it. At least the dreams were cheaper than therapists and far more entertaining than the nightly news. If you've ever stood in front of your refrigerator at 2 a.m. debating whether leftover cake counts as a balanced meal, congratulations. Every person in the 1800s would consider you a spiritual liability. To them, a midnight snack wasn't food, it was an invitation. An invitation for demons, nightmares, indigestion, family shame, and possibly the immediate collapse of your moral character. In a century where people blamed weather on soup, illness on pillows, and curses on poorly tied corsets, naturally late-night eating was treated like an act of supernatural rebellion. The rule was simple. If the sun's gone down, the kitchen is closed, and if you open it, darkness might open something back. Let's start with the most popular fear, nightmares. Not normal nightmares, not I'm late for work nightmares. 19th century nightmares were expected to include demons sitting on your chest, horses stomping through your dreams, shadow men whispering tax advice, or your deceased grandmother asking why you don't visit more. Any nighttime digestive activity was believed to heat the blood, which supposedly heated the imagination, which allegedly opened the gateway to nocturnal torment. In short, eat a biscuit at midnight, and suddenly you've got a spiritual visitor asking if you have a moment to discuss eternal damnation. This belief wasn't random, it was a glorious stew of bad science and high anxiety. Before sleep psychology existed, Victorians interpreted dreams like coded messages from the supernatural, the digestive tract, or both. The stomach and the soul were seen as practically roommates. If one was upset, the other slammed the door. So heavy or late eating wasn't just a health risk, it was a moral one. A gurgling stomach meant a gurgling conscience. And if your stomach spoke too loudly, it wasn't indigestion. It was a warning sign that the forces of darkness were preparing a home visit. Then came the fear that late-night eating allowed spirits to slip into the household, and not the friendly Victorian séance kind of spirits. People believed that eating after dark signaled to wandering supernatural forces that the home was active, making you an easier target for possession, curses, or the ghostly equivalent of a sales pitch. Many households insisted that all fire, including cooking flames, be extinguished before bed, because light was considered a beacon for roaming entities. Basically, imagine ghosts seeing your kitchen candle like a neon open sign at a diner. Oh look, they're serving fear-flavoured stew tonight. Let's drop in. But it wasn't just spirits you had to worry about. Enter the enormously dramatic concept of digestive rebellion. Physicians, or rather, physicians who relied more on vibes than science, warned that eating late could disrupt the natural humours, overwhelm the organs, or cause nocturnal derangements. That phrase alone sounds like something that should be treated with an exorcist, not a doctor. One 19th century guide even claimed that people who ate before bed risked their stomach ascending into unrest, which frankly sounds like the organ was planning a coup. This created an entire culture of moral food discipline. Eating at night wasn't merely unhealthy, it was a sign of weak character. A respectable person controlled their impulses. A gluttonous nighttime eater clearly had a loose soul. Some households even enforced strict curfews on food, ensuring nothing passed anyone's lips after the respectable hour, which was usually around sundown, because in true Victorian fashion, self-denial was more important than pleasure, flavour or joy. Even midnight hunger had its own superstitions. Feeling hungry at night meant one of the following. A ghost was drawing energy from you. Someone was thinking ill of you. Your future involved financial disaster. Your digestive system was possessed by something unholy. You were simply morally weak, the most likely explanation according to the Victorian parenting manuals. Notice that none of these possibilities include, maybe you didn't eat enough dinner. No, that would be too logical, and as we've learned, logic often slept someplace else in the 1800s. Let's not forget the warnings against cheese before bed, a special category of fear. Cheese key, with its rebellious bacteria and mysterious aging process, was considered especially dangerous. Many believed that a nighttime nibble could lead to violent dreams, prophetic nightmares, or spiritual visitations. Some even claimed that cheese clouded the mind's threshold, which sounds poetic until you realise they meant it literally. Eat cheddar after 9 p.m. and suddenly your brain was an unlocked window. Sweets? Worse. Sugary foods were believed to excite the spirits within, making you more vulnerable to supernatural attention. Eating pie at midnight could apparently summon everything except common sense. And yes, there were even rules for which foods were safest to eat before bed. Warm milk? Maybe. Dry bread? Possibly. Cold meat? Absolutely not. Fruit? Only if you wanted to dream of doom. Anything spicy? Congratulations, you've just summoned Lucifer's gastroenterologist. Even children were lectured about this. 19th century parenting guides warned kids not to tempt the night with heavy victuals, which is a fancy way of saying, stop sneaking cookies after bedtime or the darkness will eat you first. By the time you've absorbed all this, it becomes clear that the midnight kitchen wasn't a place of comfort. It was a battleground between hunger and cosmic terror. If you approached it after sundown, you weren't just getting a snack, you were rolling the dice with your spiritual safety, your digestive peace, and your family's reputation. The good news, nighttime food won't summon demons today. The bad news, it might still summon acid reflux. In the 1800s, nighttime wasn't a peaceful moment of rest. It was the daily boss battle against unseen forces waiting to sabotage your dreams, your sleep, your sanity, and, apparently, your candle budget. Because long before electric lighting, the humble candle had a second job, spiritual security guard. People weren't lighting candles simply to see, they were lighting them to negotiate with the supernatural. And if that candle so much as flickered funny, the 19th century concluded one thing. Something in this house has angered a ghost and we should definitely panic. To understand candle rituals, you first need to understand the 1800s obsession with nighttime. Modern people fear burglars and raccoons. Victorians feared fog, moonbeams, and the suspicious silence of their own bedrooms. Darkness wasn't just absence of light. It was the playground of spirits, witches, demons, and every deceased relative who maybe liked you a little too much. The candle thus became the ultimate night companion, a warm, waxy insurance policy against everything from bad dreams to bad omens. Colour mattered. The Victorians treated candle colours the way modern people treat vitamin supplements, thoroughly, passionately, and without any scientific foundation. White candles invited purity and peaceful sleep. Blue candles kept nightmares from sneaking in. Red candles. That was for people who really wanted to wrestle evil forces before bed. If someone lit a red candle at 10 p.m, it meant one of two things. They were facing supernatural danger, or they were extremely dramatic and wanted the neighbours to think so. Yellow candles calmed quarrelsome households, supposedly preventing dream-fueled arguments, because nothing holds a marriage together like burning beeswax, the correct shade of corn. But the rituals went deeper. Candle placement was practically a science, if by science we mean elaborate guessing. Families placed candles near windows to repel wandering spirits, near beds to protect sleeping bodies, and near doors to block night walkers, a vague term that included everything from ghosts to criminals to overly enthusiastic relatives stopping by unannounced. Some households even placed candles in hallways to appease ancestors. Essentially, if you lived in the 1800s, your house at night looked like a birthday cake that took spiritual warfare very seriously. Then came the matter of candle length. A short candle meant vulnerability. A tall candle meant protection. But the truly alarming sign was when a candle burned unevenly. Modern people see an uneven candle and think, oops, draft. Victorians saw an uneven candle and thought, someone in this house has offended a ghost, a demon, or worst of all, a disapproving grandmother spirit. If wax dripped too quickly on one side, it predicted illness. If a flame sputtered, someone was speaking ill of you. If the wick bent, rumour had it you'd soon receive unwanted news. The 1800s were, in short, a time when dinner parties could be ruined by a candle exhaling too loudly. There were also timing rituals. A candle lit before sunset could protect the household from nightmares. A candle lit after sunset protected against different nightmares. And blowing out a candle before midnight? Absolutely forbidden, unless you wanted to personally invite misfortune to set up permanent residence in your home. So if someone in the house forgot and blew out the candle early, the rest of the family didn't say, oops. They said, congratulations, Jonathan, you've doomed us all. Then, of course, came the reading of the flame, a nightly ritual beloved by people who wanted to predict the future using fire that also actively wanted to burn down their house. A calm flame meant good dreams. A dancing flame meant a spirit was trying to communicate. A flame that suddenly extended upward signalled the presence of a ghost, which, for some reason, everyone treated like a normal occurrence. If the flame shrank, someone was lying. Imagine the mental strain of watching a piece of burning string and thinking, is that flicker telling me my cousin stole my bread again? For families who feared the supernatural but were also thrifty, reusing candle wax was its own moral dilemma. Remelting old candles could trap bad energy in the new one. But throwing wax away could anger household spirits who apparently had strong opinions about sustainability. This put everyone in a difficult position, torn between tradition, superstition, and the rising price of candle materials. Some people combined candle rituals with prayer, chanting, or, most creatively, muttering personal insults at evil spirits. Others left candles burning all night long to create a wall of light, which sounds very majestic until you realise it also created a wall of house fires. But risk aside, many believed that as long as the candle was burning, nightmares were locked outside like cold callers or nosy neighbours. Ultimately, candle rituals weren't just about light or superstition. They were about feeling in control of a world that constantly refused to make sense. Illness struck suddenly. Night air was suspicious. Dreams were unpredictable. The spirit world felt uncomfortably close. So people clung to their candles, tiny flickering shields that let them believe they had even a sliver of power over what happened when their eyes closed. And if a ghost was upset, well, at least you had a candle to negotiate with. If you've ever woken up in the middle of the night, caught your own blurry reflection in a dark mirror, and thought, absolutely not, then congratulations, you and the Victorians would have gotten along beautifully. To them, mirrors weren't just reflective surfaces. Oh no, they were shimmering portals with an overinflated sense of responsibility. Potential traps for wandering souls, surveillance tools for spirits, gateways for the supernatural, and co-conspirators in sleep-related disasters. Essentially, a rectangle of polished glass had more lore attached to it than half the medical textbooks of the era. Victorians were extremely comfortable living in a world where science and superstition sat together like mismatched dinner guests. Germ theory? Maybe. Ghosts in the pantry? Definitely. So when it came to mirrors, which showed you a perfect version of yourself without even charging rent, people became deeply suspicious. The idea that a mirror reflected you was fine in daylight, but at night? That was when logic clocked out. left the building, and let folklore run the shift. The most widespread belief was that mirrors could trap your soul while you slept. According to this charming theory, the moment you drifted off into unconsciousness, your spirit decided to take a leisurely nighttime stroll. Nothing serious, just a casual float around the bedroom to check on things, maybe judge your furniture choices, but if it wandered past a mirror. Disaster. The glass could suck it in like a spiritual vacuum cleaner, and once trapped, your soul might not return before morning, leaving you feeling exhausted, weak, unlucky, or, worst case scenario, dead. Victorians didn't have sleep studies, but if they did, they would have diagnosed everything from insomnia to morning grumpiness as soul partially absorbed by furniture. This fear intensified when the spiritualist movement took off. Seances flourished. Mediums claimed household mirrors held echoes of the dead. People believed the boundary between worlds was basically tissue paper, especially at night, especially in bedrooms, and especially if the cat stared at something invisible for too long. Mirrors became suspicious objects lurking quietly in corners, reflecting far more than they should. Even an ordinary late-night creak could send someone lunging across the room to throw a shawl over a mirror, just in case the dead were feeling conversational. Then came the fear of reflected spirits, those uninvited nighttime guests who absolutely loved shiny surfaces. Victorians believed a mirror could act like a lighthouse for roaming entities. It didn't matter if the house was locked, the chimney stuffed, and the windows sealed like pickles in a jar. If a mirror caught a stray spirit's attention, it might wander in for a peek, and if it liked what it saw, it stayed. Permanently. Your home wasn't haunted by accident, it was your decor's fault. This belief explains why families covered mirrors during funerals. It wasn't sentimental, it was practical. No grieving household wanted the recently deceased to look around, spot a reflective surface and think, "Lovely, I'll just slip in there." A mirror was essentially a spiritual USB port, and Victorians did not want accidental uploads. But nighttime fears weren't only about ghosts. For some, mirrors were blamed for sleep paralysis, a condition Victorians had zero scientific explanation for but plenty of supernatural enthusiasm. Waking up unable to move, seeing shadows, feeling pressure on the chest, all of it was terrifying enough. But add a mirror into the mix. Now your immobilized self might see something in the reflection that didn't belong. People described shadowy figures lurking behind them, distorted versions of their own faces, or eyes glowing in the glass. Today we call these hallucinations. In the 1800s, they called them a strong reason to redecorate the entire room immediately. Many people refused to sleep in a room with a mirror facing the bed. Reflective surfaces were believed to double the self, confuse the spirit, or leave a person open to possession during moments of vulnerability. One superstition warned that a mirror could steal the dreams right out of your head, which, in an era where dreams predicted everything from your marriage prospects to your crop yields, was very bad news indeed. Victorians relied on dreams the way we rely on Google, and losing one to a mischievous piece of furniture felt like personal sabotage. Even the placement of mirrors mattered. A mirror opposite a window meant the moonlight might activate it. A mirror near the door could invite beings passing by. A mirror beside the wardrobe? Too much temptation for spirits who, apparently, loved trying on other people's clothes. The fact that none of this had any evidence didn't matter. Superstition thrives on vibes, not data. And so, every night, families transformed their bedrooms into anti-haunting fortresses. Mirrors were draped with scarves, towels, linens, coats, anything that prevented glass from getting ideas. Some people hung small charms on the cloth covering the mirror to weigh down the spirits. Others sprinkled salt on the dresser to deter supernatural activity, because if one thing frightened ghosts, it was basic seasoning. But perhaps the most charming detail is this. Even skeptics often covered their mirrors just in case. Nobody wanted to be the person who said, "Ghosts aren't real," and then woke up soul deficient. Superstition wasn't about belief, it was about insurance. In the end, Victorian mirror fear reveals something universal. Nighttime makes the brain dramatic. A mirror at 2 p.m. is a practical grooming tool. A mirror at 2 a.m. is a portal, a threat, or a judgmental rectangle waiting to ruin your life. The Victorians simply expressed that fear with more poetry, more anxiety, and more decorative fabric. And so every night mirrors slumbered under their protective coverings, silent, neutral objects that were treated like mischievous roommates. Because in the 1800s, even your furniture had the potential to ruin your sleep. If you lived in the 1800s and wanted to sleep peacefully, you didn't trust science, medicine, or even your mattress. No, you trusted salt, plain, unremarkable kitchen-grade salt. The Victorians saw salt not as a seasoning, but as a kind of spiritual riot police. It didn't just flavour your dinner. It guarded your soul, defended your household, and apparently repelled anything that went bump, float, or hiss in the night. In an era where people feared everything from lurking spirits to their own reflection, salt was the closest thing they had to a universal security system. And the best part, it worked whether you believed in it or not, at least according to every elderly aunt who insisted your nightmares were because your bed lacked proper sodium reinforcement. To understand the salt under the bed movement, picture a Victorian bedroom. Heavy drapes, too many fabrics, wallpaper with patterns so intense they might haunt you by themselves. And in the middle of it all, a solemn line of salt carefully poured around the bed frame. Some families made minimalist choices, sprinkling a neat line under the headboard. Others created full salt circles that would make a modern Wiccan whisper, "Tone it down." And then there were the enthusiastic households who tossed fistfuls under every leg of the bed in case a particularly determined ghost tried to shimmy in diagonally. The logic behind this ritual depended on whom you asked. If you spoke with a religiously inclined Victorian, they might tell you that salt symbolised purity, protection, and divine blessing. If you spoke with a more folklore-loving individual, they'd explain that spirits simply couldn't cross a salt line, because reasons, ghost physics, supernatural union regulations, the Victorians never fully explained it, but they were passionate about enforcing it. Salt was like a spiritual police barrier. Spectres, do not cross. In their minds, even the most vengeful ghost would stop, look at the salt, shrug, and turn around like a defeated salesman. For some families, salt was specifically used to fend off malicious spirits of the recently deceased. The 1800s had enough disease outbreaks to keep undertakers busy, so houses spent a lot of time worrying that Uncle Henry might return, not for emotional closure but to complain about the curtains. The solution? A salt line under the bed to discourage ghostly late-night visits from relatives who refused to leave the living alone when they were alive, much less now. Others used salt to protect against wandering spirits who supposedly wandered through homes at night like sleepwalking tourists. These spirits were believed to be sensitive, petty, and easily offended, essentially Victorian influences without the ring lights. If you upset one during the day, perhaps by sweeping dirt toward the front door, or failing to say good evening to empty air, it might follow you into your bedroom. The only way to make it lose interest, apparently, was to demonstrate strong household boundaries through strategic seasoning. There was also a medical angle, or what passed for one. Some Victorians believed nightmares were caused by bad air, bad digestion, bad emotions, or bad moral choices, depending on which doctor you asked. But others insisted nightmares were caused by night spirits pressing on your chest, which meant the only cure was to prevent the spirits from reaching your bed at all. Salt was their go-to solution because, as one 19th century folklore collector wrote, spirits detest purity. In practical terms, salt was cheap, portable, and didn't require approval from a clergyman or doctor, making it the Swiss Army knife of Victorian superstition. The real beauty of the salt ritual was how seriously people took it. A ruined salt line, say from stepping on it, sweeping it, or having a dog eat it, was considered a full security breach. Households treated this like a modern alarm going off. People would rush to repair it immediately, arguing over the correct amount of salt needed. Some insisted a thin line was enough. Others demanded thick borders, claiming that a faint line was like locking your door but leaving the window wide open. Salt also became a nighttime social indicator. If your child had nightmares, you forgot the salt. If your husband woke up cranky, he slept outside the salt perimeter. If your mother-in-law stayed over and claimed the house felt cursed, more salt. Victorians could blame almost anything on the lack or incorrect placement of salt. It was the 19th century version of turning something off and on again. There were even specific instructions about how to pour the salt. Some said it had to be done clockwise to bring blessings. Others said counterclockwise to banish negativity. Some believed you had to pour in silence. Others insisted you should whisper a protective rhyme like, "Salt to guard, salt to keep, let no spirit disturb my sleep." Imagine reciting poetry to your pantry ingredients every night before bed. It was peak Victorian energy. By the late 1800s, salt rituals had evolved into something more theatrical. Certain communities started adding coal, chalk, or herbs to strengthen the barrier. Others upgraded to salt-filled bags tied to bedposts. And then there were those who slept with small salt packets under their pillows, just in case a particularly nimble spirit managed to bypass the perimeter. Salt became so essential that some families kept emergency jars at the bedside, ready to deploy ghost deterrent like heroic paranormal firefighters. Was any of this logical? Absolutely not. But for the Victorians, nighttime was a dangerous liminal space where dreams, illnesses, spirits, and fears blended into one. And if something as simple as salt helped them face the darkness with a little more confidence, even if that confidence was wildly misplaced, they weren't going to question it. In the 1800s, you couldn't control the economy or disease or the fact that houses creaked like they were auditioning for a horror novel. But you could throw salt under your bed and tell the universe, "Not tonight." And for the Victorians, that was all the peace of mind they needed. If you've ever slipped into a brand new outfit and thought, "Wow, I feel great," congratulations, you've already broken a major 19th century superstition. In the 1800s, the idea of wearing new clothes to bed was about as horrifying as waking up to find your cow reading ominous Latin phrases. It wasn't just frowned upon, it was a full-blown spiritual no-go zone. Because in Victorian thinking, sleep wasn't merely rest, it was a nightly negotiation with the great cosmic unknown. And if you dared to enter that negotiation dressed in something fresh off the tailor's table, well, the supernatural would assume you were trying to show off, and nothing angered spirits more than someone being fashionable at the wrong time. To understand this superstition, you have to imagine a society where everything had some kind of invisible moral weight. Your bread judged you, your hat judged you, your cough judged you, your furniture, if it creaked the wrong way, probably judged you. So naturally, your clothes weren't exempt. Every garment was thought to possess a kind of settling energy, a moral temper that needed time to adjust to its new owner. A new garment was spiritually raw, like an untrained dog, an unbaked loaf, or a teenager learning manners. It needed time to bond with your body and spirit, and sleeping in it too soon risked shocking the poor thing into misfortune. One common belief was that wearing new clothes to bed confused the spirits that watched over the household. These spirits, who apparently had a full-time job keeping tabs on wardrobes, were thought to enter a bedroom at night to confirm that everything and everyone was in their proper place. When they arrived to find you asleep in a brand new nightgown, dress or shirt, they interpreted it as deceit. Why, the spirit might ask, is this human pretending to be someone else at midnight? And because spirits were famously touchy in the 1800s, the conclusion was simple. Deceit deserved punishment. Misfortune followed. Some believed the punishment was death. Others said it was illness, nightmares, a family argument, a lost opportunity, or the garment itself becoming unlucky. Imagine saving up for a beautiful new shirt, proudly wearing it to bed, and waking up to villagers whispering, "Well, that shirt is cursed now, throw it in the river." In some towns, women gag dramatically at the mere idea of sleeping in new clothing, as if the garment might strangle you in your sleep for daring to disrespect it. Still others claim that wearing something new into the realm of dreams created an open invitation for wandering spirits to attach themselves to the garment. Not to your soul, that would be too straightforward, but to the cloth itself. And once attached, They supposedly stayed, permanently, which meant that wearing the garment during the day risked carrying a freeloading ghost to the market, to church, or into your marriage prospects. The last thing anyone wanted was their neighbours noticing their new jacket and whispering, "Yes, but it seems occupied." Another fear was that sleeping in new clothing drained its luck before it had a chance to activate. Clothing was believed to absorb a good fortune through daily wear, sunlight, movement, social interaction. Sleeping in it too soon was like opening a gift early. You spoil the magic. Some families would let new garments hang for days or weeks before allowing anyone to wear them, just so the luck inside could settle and ripen. It made closets look less like storage spaces and more like spiritual incubators. And then there were the death garments. This belief held that if you slept in a new outfit, spirits might mistake you for someone preparing for burial. New clothes were often used to dress the dead. So wearing something unworn at night blurred the line between the living and the almost departed. The logic went something like, if spirits see you dressed like a corpse while you sleep, they might simply finish the job, which, to Victorians, was far more reasonable than washing your blankets or checking your windows. Some households added layers of rules. Never sleep in new socks, spirits disliked confident feet. Never sleep in a new dress, spirits disapproved of overdressing for unconsciousness. Never sleep in new trousers, spirits feared ambition. Never sleep in new undergarments, spirits apparently respected modesty. Even tailors participated in the superstition, cautioning customers to break in new clothing before bedtime by wearing it in the daylight hours, ideally while performing mundane tasks. The more boring the task, the safer the garment became. Want to cleanse the spiritual danger from your new shirt? Sweep a floor. Want your dress to lose its ghost magnetism? Peel potatoes. Ultimately, the superstition reflects an era terrified of the unseen, diseases they didn't understand, forces they couldn't explain, and the lingering belief that the supernatural had time to micromanage their wardrobes. Nighttime was the most vulnerable period of the day, so anything worn during it needed to be spiritually safe, familiar, predictable. New clothes were the opposite. Bold, fresh, suspiciously energetic. So no matter how excited someone was about their new outfit, they would never go to bed wearing it. Sleeping in new clothes wasn't luxurious. It wasn't glamorous. It was tempting the supernatural to comment on your fashion choices and trust the Victorians. The spirits were far harsher than any modern fashion critic. If you have ever fallen asleep with your curtains open and woken up feeling slightly disoriented, congratulations. You have accidentally recreated one of the 1800s' greatest medical and supernatural emergencies. For the people of the 19th century, moonlight wasn't just a gentle, poetic glow. It was a danger, a curse, a silent intruder that could ruin your health, scramble your brain, steal your sanity, and possibly give you feelings you weren't ready to unpack. In the 1800s, the moon wasn't romantic. It was a celestial burglar testing your emotional stability. To modern eyes, moonlight is simply sunlight doing a half-hearted cosplay. But to the Victorians, it was a force with opinions, an unpredictable beam of energy that had no business shining on sleeping humans. Doctors, priests, grandmothers, and your neighbour who owned one cow but infinite confidence all agreed. If moonlight touched your face while sleeping, you would likely wake up mentally altered, spiritually compromised, or acting strangely, which in Victorian terms meant anything from crying at a newspaper headline to using the wrong spoon at dinner. The fear of moonlight went back centuries, of course, but the 1800s perfected it, polished it, and turned it into a household survival rule, and the logic was beautifully flawed. For example, full moons cause madness, therefore sleeping under moonlight multiplies the madness. Another favourite, moonlight steals moisture from your body, shrivels the mind, and transforms your dreams into chaotic psychological experiments. And maybe the most dramatic belief of all, moonlight could trigger moonstroke, a tragic condition where the patient behaved as though the universe had personally betrayed them. Victorians believed moonlight was an active agent capable of slipping into a room like a polite assassin. The idea wasn't that moonlight merely shone on you. No, it entered your pores, your thoughts, and your unspoken fears. If even a ribbon of pale light glided across your cheek at 2 a.m, people believed it could unleash nightmares so vivid you'd swear the moon was personally lecturing you. Some described waking up feeling drained of moral strength, as if moonlight had siphoned off their willpower overnight like an energy vampire with a flexible schedule. Parents naturally panicked the most. A child accidentally napped under moonlight? Immediate crisis. Some households had entire moonlight protocols, windows locked, curtains shut, blankets placed strategically to shield delicate faces. Some even tucked children into makeshift shadow forts. Small barricades constructed with furniture, quilts, and anything that could block lunar rays. Imagine a room full of chairs and shawls arranged like a miniature fortress, not to keep monsters out, but to keep moonlight from turning little Timothy into a dramatic poet with unstable emotions. And yes, there were actual medical warnings. Some physicians insisted moonlight could soften the brain, diminish vitality, or agitate the humours. Humours, of course, being that favourite old medical concept that refused to die quietly. One even wrote that sleeping under a full moon caused excessive dreaming, which Victorians considered a sign of psychological decay. To them, the ideal dreamless sleep meant your brain was behaving. If you dreamed too colourfully, the moon had clearly meddled. Religious anxieties layered on top of this. Moonlight, being mysterious and uncontrollable, was sometimes considered spiritually suspicious. People whispered that spirits travelled along moonbeams like commuters taking a strange celestial bus route. If the moonlight hit your bed, you weren't just exposed to cold air, you were exposed to wandering souls, mischief-making spirits, ancestral critics, and that one ghost who just wanted to rearrange your furniture. Superstitions varied by region. In some areas, moonlight falling on a sleeping person was said to invite the Fae, and nobody wanted to be on the Fae's guest list, especially if it meant waking up with strange dreams or missing socks. Other communities believed moonlight caused sleepwalking, not because of biology, but because the moon tempted the soul outdoors. The worst scenario involved waking to find yourself standing in the yard in your nightshirt, staring at the moon like it owed you rent. Even farmers weren't safe from the lunar drama. Some believed moonlight could spoil fresh milk left on a table, sour bread dough, or make linens brittle, so if moonlight could destroy laundry, imagine what it could do to your frail, overly dramatic human mind. And then there were the stories, because the 1800s were powered by stories, gossip, and the unshakable confidence that your aunt's neighbour's cousin's misfortune was definitely caused by supernatural interference. Tales abounded of people who slept in moonlight and woke changed, melancholy, irritable, excessively poetic, unusually cheerful, suspiciously quiet, or otherwise acting in ways that made everyone say, "Ah yes, classic moon damage." What makes all of this even better is that Victorians lived during a time when gas lamps, coal fires and thick curtains already made bedrooms as dark as subterranean caves, yet they still treated stray moonlight like a cosmic hazard, with personal grudges. So families developed habits, curtains triple-layered, shutters secured, beds positioned away from windows, and furniture strategically placed not for convenience but for lunar avoidance. Bedrooms became labyrinths of shadows and blocked beams, all to prevent emotional collapse via moonbeam. To sleep safely in the 1800s, you didn't just rest, you defended yourself from the moon. If you think your nighttime routine is complicated, flossing, skincare, checking if the door is really locked, you have nothing on the 1800s. Bedtime back then wasn't a peaceful descent into dreams, it was a ceremonial obstacle course designed to keep ghosts bored, illnesses discouraged, and misfortune thoroughly confused. For 19th century households, going to bed wasn't just time to sleep. It was time to perform a series of mysterious rituals so the universe doesn't personally attack you at 3 a.m. And the Victorians didn't see this as strange. After all, this was a century where people believed the moon could melt your brain, onions could predict gossip, and shoes on a table could trigger famine. Naturally, bedtime required spiritual armor. Let's begin with perhaps the most widespread nighttime ritual of all, washing hands before bed. Today, we might call this hygiene. In the 1800s, however, hand washing wasn't about cleanliness. It was about scrubbing off spiritual contamination. People believed you picked up invisible spiritual residue throughout the day. Envy from neighbours, anger from passers-by, curses floating through the air like disappointed pigeons. If you didn't wash your hands before sleep, congratulations, you were inviting every bad mood, bad omen, and grumpy household spirit to sit on your pillow and critique your dreams. Parents scolded children not because they were dirty, but because unwashed fingers might carry troubles into tomorrow. One Victorian diary even noted that failing to wash hands could invite the devil to steer the night. Modern germs must be furious they didn't receive this kind of dramatic PR. Then came hairbrushing, a ritual so superstitiously loaded that even brushing too few strokes was risky. Many Victorians believed hair held emotions, thoughts, and even fragments of the soul. If you didn't brush your hair before bed, those tangled thoughts might twist into nightmares. A knot in your hair wasn't just a knot, it was a mischief snare, a trap left by spirits trying to meddle with your dreams. Too many knots meant you had been visited during the day by someone with ill intentions. The logic was flawless. Hair plus knots equals ghostly interference. Therefore, brushing your hair wasn't grooming, it was performing spiritual recon. Parents told children to brush away shadow thoughts before bed, all while knowing poor little Henry had simply rolled around in grass like a deranged goat earlier that afternoon. But brushing wasn't the only hair-based superstition. Some Victorians believed you had to touch a specific object after brushing, often wood, iron, or a family Bible, to seal your mind for the night. The explanation? To prevent spirits from mistaking loose thoughts as invitations. That's right. If you didn't gently tap your bedpost twice or touch the iron handle on the dresser, spirits might assume you'd sent them a handwritten RSVP. People lived in constant fear of accidentally scheduling paranormal appointments. There were also face-washing rituals, which, again, not about hygiene. Washing your face at night was said to remove night whispers, traces of unseen beings that might have brushed past you during the day. Those who skipped it risked waking up with nightmares or, worse, someone else's dream. Imagine explaining to your spouse that you weren't irritated because of work. You simply forgot to wash off the astral beings, and now you're emotionally exhausted from dreaming you were a wheelbarrow. But the most dramatic of all bedtime rituals? Touching protective household objects before crawling under the covers. Families kept night guardians, items believed to shield them from nightmares. A hairbrush, a wooden spoon, a Bible, a cluster of dried herbs, a chunk of coal, or, my personal favourite, a potato. Yes, a potato, because nothing terrifies evil spirits like root vegetables with a strong work ethic. These objects each had their own mystical job descriptions. A wooden spoon repelled spirits of misfortune. Coal prevented dark dreams. Bibles were spiritual locks, sealing the bedroom. And potatoes, they absorbed wandering fears, according to one 1842 folk guide. Imagine a grown adult patting a potato before bed like, "All right, Gerald, keep nightmares busy tonight." Other rituals included brushing the bed itself, literally sweeping the mattress with a small cloth to remove lurking negativity. Bedsheet fluffing, also a ritual. Removing wrinkles was believed to flatten out emotional disruptions, because apparently even linens had opinions about your feelings. Some families even circled the bed once clockwise before entering it to confuse spirit, which is ironic because nothing confuses spirits more than watching a human perform a lap like they're warming up for bed sprinting. The Victorians also had nighttime breath rituals. Before blowing out a candle, one must breathe gently over the flame without extinguishing it. Why? To prevent breath-binding spirits from capturing your soul mid-exhale If someone did accidentally blow out the candle with a strong breath, they were told to inhale deeply 3 times to reclaim their wandering essence. Picture a household full of people taking dramatic inhalations because someone sneezed while putting out a candle. And let's not forget verbal rituals. Many families said a specific phrase, part prayer, part verbal booby trap, to protect themselves from nocturnal misfortune. Nothing from the dark may follow me was one. What walks in shadow shall not enter was another. Some were less poetic, like the downright exhausted sounding, "Do not trouble this house tonight," which sounds like a parent speaking to a toddler ghost who just won't stop knocking things over. In the end, bedtime in the 1800s wasn't cozy. It was a spiritual administrative meeting, a checklist of warding off nightmares, ghosts, curses, and negative energy. Forget weighted blankets, they had potatoes. Forget mindfulness apps, they tapped bedposts. Forget herbal teas, they brushed away shadow thoughts. But to them, these rituals provided the illusion of control, proof that in a world full of mysterious illnesses, eerie dreams, and absolutely no germ theory, they were at least trying to keep the chaos at bay. And honestly, who among us hasn't whispered a little bedtime plea at night, even if it's just "please don't let tomorrow be weird"? If you've made it through chapters of food that tattles on you, clothing that threatens to ruin your life, and sleep habits that apparently determined whether you live to see breakfast, you may be wondering one thing. Why were 1800s people like this? How did an entire century survive while believing eggs could curse them, hats could doom them, soup could predict storms, and moonlight was basically nature's laser beam of insanity? The short answer is simple, because the 1800s were terrifying and superstitions were emotional survival gear. The long answer? Pull up a chair. You're about to understand why the century looked less like a calm stroll through time and more like a chaotic obstacle course where reality constantly tripped you. The 1800s were shaped by forces that would make anyone panic invent new beliefs. You had industrialization turning cities into smoky metal forests, medicine still guessing 70% of the time, food preservation that relied heavily on hope, and a social structure wobbling between tradition and innovation. And amidst all of this, people were confronted with illnesses they couldn't cure, storms they couldn't predict, and neighbours who seemed suspiciously comfortable blaming demons for everything from spoiled milk to failed marriages. When you live in a world where you can die from an infection you got while tying your boots, you cling to any rule that promises safety, even if that rule is "don't turn your pillow the wrong way or the universe will personally smite you." Superstitions in the 1800s weren't just quirky extras in people's lives, they were a coping mechanism. These beliefs functioned like emotional shock absorbers in a world that didn't come with a manual. For the average person, the universe felt like it ran on cosmic mood swings. The weather changed without warning. People got sick overnight. Bread rose inconsistently, which was not just culinary disappointment, it was interpreted as an omen of familial disgrace. When everything feels unpredictable, the mind desperately tries to impose order, even if that order comes in the shape of rules like, never cut bread after sunset unless you enjoy being haunted. And it wasn't just fear. Superstitions gave people control, or at least the illusion of it. Could they stop cholera? No. Could they stop a thunderstorm? Also no. Could they adjust their hat so death wouldn't visit this week? Absolutely yes. Nothing soothed an anxious Victorian quite like believing that a well-placed button, a properly folded collar, or a line of salt under the bed could hold the universe together by sheer force of etiquette. If reality wouldn't cooperate, then at least the sleeves and shoelaces would. You also have to understand that the 1800s were a time when science, religion, folklore and rumour lived in one crowded room, and no one was supervising. You might attend a church sermon in the morning warning you about morale decay, read a newspaper at lunch insisting that comets cause madness, and listen to your grandmother explain at dinner that your sore throat came from sleeping with your feet facing the door, all with the same amount of credibility. The result was a century where logic didn't so much disappear as take a vacation, and nobody knew when it was coming back. But beyond the absurdity, these beliefs created something valuable: community coherence. A superstition wasn't just a rule, it was a shared language. Everyone understood what it meant when someone gasped at shoes on a table or recoiled from a hat on a bed. Superstition stitched people together. They offered reassurance. They created rituals families could bond over, whether that meant lighting protective candles at night or lecturing children about not inviting evil winds into the bedroom by opening a window. Anxiety became a group project. Even sleep, the time when you should, ideally, not worry, became a carefully moderated spiritual exam. People followed rules not just because they feared ghostly consequences, but because those rules gave structure to the unstructured. When your day ends with "make sure the moon doesn't touch your face or you'll go insane," bedtime isn't just about rest. It's about participating in a cosmic hygiene routine. And so, after all the anxieties, the demons, the cursed eggs, judgmental soup, silently disapproving corsets, emotional milk, spiritually aggressive buttons, and door-aligned feet, we finally reach the truth. 19th century people needed superstition for the same reason modern people need stress eating, aromatherapy, and typing. Why am I like this into Google at 2 a.m? It helped them function. Superstition was comfort disguised as nonsense. It was order pretending to be magic. It was emotional band-aid technology centuries before the invention of therapy. And it worked, mostly, at least enough to get them through a century that threw plagues, wars, industrial chaos, and extremely confusing fashion standards at them. So here we end our journey. The good news? These beliefs are gone. The bad news? Some people still believe half of them. And the worst news? Some of us absolutely still sleep with the door closed because it feels safer, which is basically a modern superstition with better branding.